Pilami ayelo, mitaku yepi. Hello, thank you and welcome to all my relations who are joining our symposium today. We're very deeply honored to have each of you join us. Looks like quite a number of people are already joining in, so wonderful to see everybody. And also see that our Dean of our School of Medicine and Health Sciences, Dr. Joshua Wynn, is here as well. So thank you so much for joining us. And I see a lot of good friends, colleagues, and people I've worked with throughout the years on the list of attendees. So just really deeply honored to have each of you participate in this symposium. My name is Dr. Donald Warren. I am Oglala Lakota, originally from Kyle, South Dakota, on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And we're very pleased to share some updates on our work related to research focused on trauma and resilience in American Indian and other indigenous populations. So I'm the principal investigator and the program director for our Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center. And I'll go into some detail about what the center is, what we focus on, and some of the research projects that we're engaged in already. But I also want to acknowledge today is April 22, 2022, and it is Earth Day. So also happy Earth Day to all of our colleagues joining in. And we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So if there's questions, we can perhaps have that put into the Q&A section or the chat. And certainly happy to engage each of you and hear your perspectives on what our priorities should be as we move forward with this research center. So very briefly, the Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center is a P20 grant funded through the COBRI mechanism. Those are the Centers of Biomedical Research Excellence. And we've been in existence for about a year. Unfortunately, it's been challenging to enroll subjects in research projects during the pandemic, but I think we're at the point where we're going to be starting to collect some data. But I wanted to kind of go through an overview of the rationale for looking at both trauma in terms of health disparities, but also resilience in terms of what we can do about our health disparities in terms of the challenges that we're facing in Indigenous populations. So today we'll hear from a number of speakers, and toward the end of my presentation, we'll go over the agenda. But I also want to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm very proud of the University of North Dakota for establishing a land acknowledgement in a very formal way with input from many of our tribal stakeholders in the region. So today, the University of North Dakota rests on the ancestral lands of the Pembina and Red Lake bands of Ojibwe and the Dakota Oyate, presently existing as composite parts of the Red Lake, Turtle Mountain, White Earth bands, and the Dakota tribes of Minnesota and North Dakota. We acknowledge the people who resided here for generations and recognize that the spirit of the Ojibwe and Oyate people permeates this land. As a university community, we will continue to build upon our relations with the First Nations of the state of North Dakota, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, Sisseton, Wahpeton, Oyate Nation, Spirit Lake Nation, Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, and Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. And again, I'm very proud of University of North Dakota. I think there's been some really meaningful steps in the right direction in terms of tribal engagement and acknowledging the Indigenous peoples from this region. So when we think about the tribal nations in North Dakota, we have a lot of diversity here, actually, among the American Indian population. So you can see where University of North Dakota is located kind of in the northeastern segment of the state in Grand Forks, and right on the border with East Grand Forks, Minnesota. So that's where we are located at UND. And then we have several tribal nations who are located in the state of North Dakota, including the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, way up on the border with Canada, and that's an Ojibwe tribal group. We have the Spirit Lake Nation, which is a Dakota tribal nation. Further west is the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, or the three affiliated tribes. And it's fascinating, they are three tribes culturally, but they are one federally recognized tribe that were brought together largely because of a smallpox epidemic that occurred in the 1800s. And those tribes are now the three affiliated tribes in Western North Dakota. We also have Standing Rock and Fort Yates North Dakota is the headquarters of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. The majority of the land is on the South Dakota side, but their headquarters is in North Dakota. And then we have some of the land of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate, another Dakota tribe. Some of their land is in North Dakota, but their tribal headquarters is in South Dakota. So it kind of gives you a feel for the tribal nations here in North Dakota. But as a research center, we're wanting to engage tribes from the entire region, not just the state of North Dakota. And I also think it's important to start with a kind of a common understanding of the terminology that we use. We tend to use the terms American Indian and Native American interchangeably, but they're actually legal definitions of the terms. And one of the reasons that we're focusing on working with indigenous populations is that we want to be more inclusive of populations that have similar histories and similar health challenges. So in terms of the racial designation, as we know, it's the American Indian and Alaska Native population. And the race is self-identified on the census. So we just recently had the 2020 census, and the numbers of self-identified American Indians and Alaska Natives have gone up significantly. We're now well over 2% of the US population. But the reason it's American Indian and Alaska Native, and I'm so pleased we have one of our Alaska Native faculty members, Dr. Allison Kelleher, who will be speaking a little bit later this morning. And we have to recognize that in Alaska, there are cultural groups that are closely tied to American Indian populations, like the Athabascan groups. So there's Athabascans throughout North America. Even the Navajo and Apache tribes culturally are Athabascan. So the Athabascans are all over North America. But when you look at the Inuit populations in northern Alaska, that's more of a circumpolar cultural group. So we have Inuit peoples in Alaska, but also in Siberia, Canada, and Greenland. So they are Alaska Native, but they are not culturally American Indians. That's why we have the American Indian and Alaska Native designation as the racial group. But within the population of AIAN peoples, we have enrolled tribal members. So not all self-identified American Indians and Alaska Natives are actually enrolled with their tribes. So the reason this is important is that an enrolled tribal member is actually a political designation, not a racial designation. And being an enrolled tribal member of a federally recognized tribe then allows us to have access to certain services like Indian Health Service and Bureau of Indian Affairs programs. So we use a lot of these terms interchangeably, but they do have different meanings. And I know we've all heard the term Native American as well, but it's important to recognize that the term Native American also has a legal definition. There's the Native American Programs Act from 1978 that defined Native Americans as American Indian and Alaska Native, but also other indigenous peoples of the US and its territories. So Native Hawaiians, American Samoans, the Chamorro groups in Guam, and indigenous people to Puerto Rico are Native Americans because they are indigenous to the United States. So when I'm talking about the indigenous people of North Dakota, I say American Indian. When I'm talking about all indigenous peoples of the US, then I'll say Native American. But in truth, we have so many similarities to other indigenous populations, certainly in Canada, as well as the Aboriginal groups in Australia, Pacific Islanders and Maoris in New Zealand. We see a lot of similar health disparities. So the terminology that we've been using to be more inclusive is indigenous, and recognizing that we have indigenous peoples all over the world. And the indigenous populations are the original inhabitants of the particular land in which they are located. So the original inhabitants of North America are American Indians, Alaska Natives, and First Nations in Canada. But of course, we have indigenous populations in other parts of the world. And what's really fascinating when we look at the patterns of health disparities, we see a lot of similarities, whether we're looking at diabetes or some mental health considerations, or even social circumstances like poverty. When populations are colonized, we tend to see similar outcomes across generations. So if we look at diabetes rates, for example, we have very high rates of diabetes among American Indians and Alaska Natives, but the same is true for First Nations in Canada, Aboriginal Australian groups, Pacific Islander Indigenous peoples. So there's an impact of colonization that has an intergenerational effect on the health of the populations. So we're also engaging international Indigenous populations to have a better understanding of the impact of colonization and why we're facing the health challenges that we have currently. So this map looks at the various cultural groups in North America. And as I'd mentioned, Athabascans are kind of all over North America, including in the Southwest. And we have here, of course, the Plains populations. And I'd mentioned the Ojibwe groups and the Oyate groups, or Lakota, Dakota, Nakota groups here in the Northern Great Plains. So when we look at our pattern of population in the United States, and if we look at American Indians and Alaskan Natives by state, there's only 7 states that have at least 3% American Indian or Alaskan Native population. So those 7 states include Alaska, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. And as we can see, the majority of the population is in the West, and there's only 2 states on the eastern half of the US that have at least 1% Indigenous population. That's Minnesota and North Carolina. But you can see there's large sections of the United States in which there are very few American Indian and Alaskan Native people who reside there. So that has an impact on our ability to acquire resources. It has an impact on our political voice and our ability to ensure that we're being treated in an equitable manner. So we do need partners and collaborators across the nation from other populations, just recognizing that as American Indians and Alaskan Natives, we are the minority of the minority groups. And unfortunately, we're the most underrepresented of the underrepresented minority groups. So we'll take a look at the impact of that and how that has ultimately an effect also on the health of the population. So one of the things that we're very committed to is understanding the impact of trauma on the population. And of course, depending on the audience that we're speaking to, the word trauma will have different meanings, right? We can think of physical trauma, we can think of level 1 trauma centers that are dealing with physical injury, but we're also really committed to understanding the impact of emotional and psychological trauma that on the health of population. So these could be things like one-time events, accidents or injuries, or loss of a close loved one, or loss of a job. That type of a thing can be a one-time event. But then we also have ongoing and relentless toxic stress, unfortunately, in many of our communities. And we see that in our tribal nations, particularly here in the Northern Plains. Lots of poverty, lots of violence. Unfortunately, the pandemic has worsened some circumstances related to social isolation. I wish that we had never used the term social distancing when we were talking about dealing with the pandemic. We should have been saying physical distancing. 6 feet apart is a physical distance, not a social distance. And in truth, we need social connectedness. And there's been research at other centers that shows social isolation is a determinant of poor health outcomes. So we should be promoting social connectedness even during this time frame of a pandemic. So we're seeing now the impact of the pandemic, not just in terms of infectious disease, but even with mental health outcomes. And unfortunately, we're seeing higher rates of self-medication with alcohol and other drugs. And I'm sure many of you have seen the data that our overdose death rates are increasing since the pandemic started as well. So toxic stress has a huge impact on the health of a population. And then at the societal level, unfortunately, we still deal with racism here in the US and in other parts of the world. We're seeing warfare. Just imagine the long-term impact of the war that's going on right now and the impact on the populations there. And then looking at childhood trauma. When we have trauma during childhood, that affects not only the child, but that individual for a lifelong impact. So adverse childhood experiences have a significant impact on health as those individuals become adults. for Indigenous communities, we also have to recognize the impact of historical trauma and understanding that trauma can have an impact across generations. We also have to look at the impact of colonization. And what's fascinating, again, from an Indigenous perspective, we have quite a number of English-speaking Indigenous peoples, or ESIP, English-speaking Indigenous peoples. It's kind of a phrase that we're kind of coining here. Because if you look at colonization from Great Britain, whether it's the US, Canada, Australia, or the Pacific Islands, there's a similar pattern of annexing land, putting people in communities like reservations or reserves, also utilizing things like boarding schools. And that was a repeated pattern across a multitude of Indigenous populations that were colonized by Great Britain. And today we see the same pattern of health disparities, even though they're in different hemispheres, different parts of the world, different languages, different cultures, different histories. The impact of colonization can create particular patterns of health disparities. So we have to also look at the loss of land, loss of resources, loss of language, loss of culture, and then ongoing discrimination and marginalization. So we have a lot of trauma that's having a negative impact on health outcomes, but we also have a lot of strengths as Indigenous populations. So we need to understand the impact of trauma, but we also have to identify ways in which we can invest in cultural strengths to overcome some of the health disparities. So that's really the purpose and background of our Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center. So when I think about a holistic perspective on trauma, again, we can have physical trauma and need level 1 trauma centers to address injuries. And there's been a lot of work focused on mental or psychological trauma and emotional trauma. But I think for us as Indigenous populations, we also need to look at spiritual trauma and what has happened in terms of loss of sacred places, loss of ceremony, loss of language. It's a little known fact outside of Indigenous populations here in the US, but there was about a century in which our spiritual and cultural practices were actually illegal. There was what was called the Code of Indian Offenses in 1883 that made the practice of traditional healers actually illegal. And they specifically said Sundance was illegal starting at that time frame. And then that was not reversed until the Indian Religious Freedom Act in 1978. So we had about a century in which our spiritual and cultural practices were actually against the law in the United States. So a lot of irony there that, you know, we have freedom of religion in the US, but it was, in truth, we did not have freedom of religion as Indigenous peoples here. And having that loss of spiritual and cultural connectedness and ceremony has had a negative impact across generations, and certainly has an impact on self-identity and the ability to overcome some of the challenges. So we have to recognize that trauma is not a single entity, and not every population is affected in the same manner. So that's why it's so important to have focused areas of research to have better understanding of trauma in Indigenous populations. This is a fascinating map. Someone had sent this to me, and it shows over time the loss of territory for the Indigenous population here in the US. And as I had mentioned, the majority of American Indians and Alaska Natives are now in the western half of the US. And there's a reason for that. And it's that colonization started in the East. So as a result, the Eastern tribes really absorbed the brunt of colonization. And as a result, many of those tribal nations that were in the East are no longer there, or there's very few people left. So the reason we have the majority of our population in the West is because colonization started in the East. But this is more than just a loss of territory. It's a loss of deep-rooted and meaningful connectivity to land and place. And that's something that we've observed across Indigenous populations, is that need for land-based healing, and that need for respect for the earth and connectedness to the earth, and recognizing that the earth is the dust of our ancestors, quite literally, and it's also the building block of future generations. So we have a lot of challenges in Indigenous populations that are unique in terms of loss of that connectedness to sacred places and the intergenerational impact on health. Here in Grand Forks, that's where the red circle is, this was also the historical homelands of my people, the Oyate, and the Lakota. So I'm Lakota, and we're further west, the Dakota further east, and Nakota groups further north. So we called ourselves the Oyate, or the people. And from a governance perspective, we had what was called the 7 council fires, or the Ocheti Shakawi. And that was our groupings of people in this region. And the Dakota were further east. So the reason this became the Dakota Territory, and the reason this is North Dakota, is that colonizers encountered the Dakota people first. So this became the Dakota Territory. So I always like to point out that if colonization had come from the west, this would be North Lakota, and I would be working at UNL instead of UND. But because colonization came from the east, the Dakotas were encountered first. So the Nakota were renamed Assiniboines. You may have heard of Assiniboine tribes, but very closely related to us as Lakota and Dakota peoples. So thinking about this region and why it's important to do this work at University of North Dakota, Grand Forks is called Grand Forks because it's the confluence of 2 rivers, the Red Lake River heading west and the Red River heading north. So Grand Forks was actually a gathering point for Lakota and Dakota people historically. So every time I cross over the bridge and see those 2 beautiful rivers coming together, I think to myself how beautiful that must have been, with thousands of teepees and tens of thousands of peoples gathered together right here. And I think a lot of people don't realize that there's a reason it's called Grand Forks, and it's because it's a gathering point from those 2 rivers. And long before we had highways, we had riverways for transportation. So we would use the rivers to come together. So the whole Red River Valley, which heads north into what is now Lake Winnipeg, was a gathering point for the Oyate peoples and the Ojibwe peoples as well. So as you go further north on the Red River and get into Winnipeg, Canada, you can see the Red River is joined by the Assiniboine, or the Nakota River. And there's an area in Winnipeg called the Forks, and that was another gathering point for the Ocheti Shakawi, the 7 council fires. So this whole region really has a sacred history of coming together and gathering points, particularly in the summertime. And this is where we would have ceremonies and come together to convene, to make plans, to work with our leadership, and really to promote wellness during that whole time frame. So I'm very honored to be at UND at the School of Medicine and Health Sciences. We're the northernmost medical school in the United States. I don't know if that's a selling point or not, but we are the northernmost medical school. And we're right next to Minnesota. And what I find fascinating is that most people who live here or even live in Minnesota don't know what the word Minnesota means. And Minnesota actually comes from 2 Dakota words. Mni means water, and Shota means cloudy or smoky. So in the spring and in the fall, when the weather starts to change, we have this beautiful effect where it looks like the clouds are rising off of the water. So this whole region, because of the number of lakes and rivers, was called Mni Shota Makoche, or the land where the clouds rise off of the water. It's just beautiful descriptive terminology. So Mni Shota Makoche, the land where the clouds rise off of the water. And now we just call it Minnesota, right? So that's the term that we use, but that's where the word Minnesota comes from. I also like to point out that every time you say the word Minneapolis, you're being bilingual. You should pat yourself on the back. Minneapolis actually means water city in Dakota Greek. So again, Mni is water in Dakota, and polis is city in Greek. So every time you say Minneapolis, you're saying water city in Dakota Greek. So just a little bit of our history and why it's important to understand our history and the impact of Indigenous peoples and language across multiple generations. So the next part of the discussion can be very difficult because we have to take a critical look at the impact of history and the impact of policy on the health and wellness of populations. And here, of course, looking at Indigenous peoples. So if we just think of the 48 states here, the 48 contiguous states in North America, we know that at the time of contact, the entire region was indigenous territory. And the colonization, or the 13 colonies, were just devastating to the tribes in the Northeast. And I'm sure many of us have heard of Amherst, Massachusetts, right? And Amherst College, named after Lord Jeffrey Amherst. And Amherst was a colonial governor from this time frame. And he's well known in Indian country because he is the one who ordered the distribution of blankets from a smallpox hospital to the regional tribes with the purpose of killing them. So not a happy part of our history, but it's a truthful and honest part of our history, in that the first documented case really of bioterrorism was our own colonial government. And I think for the populations, the smaller populations that survived through this, there's an intergenerational impact. And part of the challenge we face is the lack of willingness to acknowledge the truth, and even pushback against even having this type of a discussion. But we need to have these discussions, and we need to acknowledge history, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it makes us feel bad. We need to walk through truth if we are ever going to get to equity. So when we have these discussions, it's not to make anyone feel bad. That is not the purpose. The purpose is to understand the truth, and why is it that we have so much trauma and so many health disparities here in the US, and particularly with Indigenous peoples. So you can actually Google smallpox and Amherst. And yes, Google is a verb, right? We can find these things online, but this is actually the letter that was written by Lord Jeffrey Amherst. And it's in cursive, so it's a little bit difficult to read, but he says here, as he's writing to one of the colonial army leaders, he said, "You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets." So very clearly use the blankets to inoculate the Indians with smallpox. And he goes on to say, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate or get rid of this execrable or horrible race. Extirpate this execrable race. I should be very glad your scheme for hunting them down by dogs could take effect. So this is horrible. It's also, I know, very uncomfortable to think about and talk about, but it's important to understand the truth of this history, because it does have an intergenerational impact, and it's part of our history. And again, if we're going to identify solutions, we need to understand why we're dealing with some of the challenges that we have today. So that kind of has a just real brief one example of what happened in the Northeast. In the Southeast, in 1830, there was what was called the Indian Removal Act. And the Indian Removal Act of 1830 removed tribal members from their homelands in the Southeast to what is now Oklahoma. So in that process, it's also kind of colloquially known as the Trail of Tears. Many tribal members were removed from their homelands and then relocated to what is now Oklahoma. And as a result, we had this interesting dynamic where some of the tribal members refused to leave and they stayed in their homelands, where some of the tribal members did go to Oklahoma. So we have this interesting dynamic now where we have Seminoles in Florida and Seminoles in Oklahoma, Cherokees in North Carolina, Cherokees in Oklahoma, Choctaws in Mississippi, Choctaws in Oklahoma. So that's why we have that pattern, is because largely the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So it's fascinating, of the 38 federally recognized tribes in Oklahoma, only 4 of them were originally from Oklahoma. The rest were removed from other parts of the nation. And again, if we think about that, the traditional indigenous perspective of close connectivity to land and the sacredness of space and land-based healing and integrating culture, healing, and the earth together, this has an impact on the health of populations when we remove people from their homelands. Well, the discovery of gold was devastating to the tribes in California, and much of the population of California was decimated after the gold rush, essentially. So this is what we're left with. I had shown a map of the concentration by state. This shows a concentration of indigenous population by county. And you can see that the vast majority of our population is now in the West, and again, concentrated in several states, including Alaska, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. But that's a brief overview of the history in terms of why we have this pattern. So there was also just a huge devastation to the overall population. It's estimated that at the time of contact, there were probably around 20 million indigenous people in North America, at least 5 million of whom lived in what is now the United States. And by 1900, there were only about 200,000 indigenous people left in the US. So this was a near genocide, a near complete genocide of the population, unfortunately. The good news is that by 2010 census, there were over 5 million self-identified American Indians and Alaska Natives. I need to update this slide because the 2020 data came out last year and showed that there's now over 9 million self-identified American Indians and Alaska Natives. But when we see this pattern of loss in a population, that does have intergenerational impact. So we have to recognize that there is a direct line between historical trauma and chronic disease disparities. And this really does create the framework for our Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center. The other consideration historically is forced boarding school participation. And this is not ancient history. My mother is a survivor of boarding schools. Actually, the majority of our Indigenous faculty at UND have parents who were boarding school survivors, whether it was in the lower 48 states, Alaska, or Canada. We each have that similar experience as Indigenous health academics here at UND. So with the boarding schools, the way that the federal government policy was able to force children to go off to boarding schools is that as the populations were put on reservations, they lost access to traditional foods and lost their food sovereignty, and then became dependent on governmental programs for food. So the policy was to tell the families, either give up your children to go to boarding school, or we will withhold your food rations. So either give up your children or starve was essentially the choice that was given to many people. And the result is we had entire generations of children who wound up going to boarding school where they faced all kinds of trauma. This is a picture from the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And what's remarkable is many of the boarding schools have huge graveyards right next to the boarding school. And that's whether they are marked or not. And Rapid City, they have unmarked graves next to the boarding school in Rapid City, South Dakota. This one, they have a lot of headstones and marked graves, but many of the headstones say unknown. So it's a child, a precious spirit lost to history. We don't know who some of the children are who are buried here. And we don't know why there was so much excess death at the boarding schools. We know that there were outbreaks of things like tuberculosis and influenza, but it doesn't answer why there was so much excess death at the boarding schools. We probably will never know why exactly this happened. But what I think about is the survivors. If you are a child and so many of your classmates and friends are dying at an unnaturally high rate, how does that have an impact on you as a child? What is the trauma that you absorb and carry with you throughout your life, and then potentially pass off to the next generation? So this is one of the class pictures from Carlisle Indian School. And you know, I have 4 kids, and I've seen lots of class pictures over the years, and I always see smiling and laughter and joy in class pictures. But I look at this image and I don't see that. You know, I've spent a lot of time looking at this image and looking at those faces among the children, and I don't see joy. I see fear, I see sadness, and I see the outcomes of trauma. And these are our ancestors. And these are entire populations of children who had to absorb a great deal of trauma, and that has had a long-lasting impact on health. This is a very famous picture of a Navajo student who was at Carlisle Indian School. And on the left, that's when he arrived. On the right, that's 3 years later. And this was seen as a success story. And the motto of the Carlisle Indian School was to kill the Indian, save the man. So basically the goal was to get rid of the cultural connectedness among the children. And when you take away cultural connectedness, that has all kinds of negative impact. And it certainly is a challenge in terms of self-identity and long-term over the years, health-related behaviors as well. So one of the areas that we're studying at UND, in addition to our Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center, we also have a Center for Epigenomics Research, funded by the same NIH mechanism, the Centers of Biomedical Research Excellence. And I'll talk more about that in just a bit. But I think when we look at historical trauma and when we look at toxic stress, we know that we can see changes to DNA. And in some animal models, we can see that those DNA changes can be passed from one generation to the next. So we haven't delineated the exact mechanisms of the potential connectedness between epigenetics and historical trauma, but I really believe that epigenetics can provide a scientific platform to better understand intergenerational trauma. So that's part of our research priority as well. And not just to study it from an academic perspective, but to really understand the mechanisms. And if we can understand the mechanisms of intergenerational trauma, perhaps we can develop better solutions to address it. We also have gestational stressors. So stress during pregnancy is not good for us. We'll be hearing from Dr. Andrew Williams this afternoon. He'll be describing his research project within our Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center. His PhD is in maternal and child health, and he's looking at the impact of stress during pregnancy on maternal and child health outcomes. In addition, we also see food programs that can cause toxic stress if we have unhealthy food. So the WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children, in recent years, they've done a very good job of promoting breastfeeding because that's much more healthy than formula feeding. But when I was a full-time clinician working in Arizona, the WIC program on the reservation where I worked really was focused on just distributing baby formula, right? So it's basically a baby formula distribution center. And as a result of many years of WIC, we wind up seeing higher rates of formula feeding in American Indian populations as compared to non-Indian populations. And the data show very clearly that as a population, formula-fed babies grow up to have higher rates of type 2 diabetes and heart disease than breastfed babies. So essentially, the WIC program inadvertently led to more health disparities because of the easy access to baby formula. In addition, the FDPIR, Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations, also known as the Commodity Food Program, historically would distribute very unhealthy food. And many generations of people, including my generation, were exposed to, in many ways, toxins from unhealthy food. So one of the other research projects that we're looking at is the effect both from inflammation and epigenetics of traditional food and how we might reverse some of the negative impact of unhealthy food in our population. So Dr. Nicole Redvers will be presenting her research project later this afternoon, looking at traditional food. When we think of traditional food now, unfortunately, a lot of people think of fry bread, right? And historically, we never fried dough. That's basically people doing the best they can with their commodity foods from the Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations. And just like the WIC program, that's a USDA, United States Department of Agriculture food program. And on the right, you can see the elder using commodity flour and commodity shortening to make fry bread. And it's fascinating now, this has been acculturated. We kind of own it and we love it, right? We have our ceremonies and our feasts, and there's an expectation that there will be fry bread. And every time I go back home to South Dakota, there's an expectation of fry bread when we have a ceremony or a feast. And I always ask, well, why do we have the fry bread? And people say, because it's traditional. But in truth, it's not our traditions. It's people doing the best they can with commodity food. So if we want to call it traditional food, it's traditional USDA food, not traditional indigenous food. And unfortunately, it's bleached and processed and enriched flour. And I don't know why it's called enriched. Basically, enriched flour is just starch. All the nutrition's taken out of it. And then the way vegetable shortening is made is it's hydrogenated, it is saturated. And then to melt it, you have to heat it up. But it's basically the worst type of carbohydrate combined with the worst type of fat and brought together in the form of fry bread. But in truth, it's poison. We don't like to hear that sometimes, but it's true. And that's part of, unfortunately, some of the impact on nutritional epigenetics and changes over the years. So here's some images of some commodity foods that our populations have been exposed to. And I remember as a kid seeing these containers, right? The beef and pork, kind of almost like a Spam-like meat product, but not really. You can see the big blocks of cheese. You know, we like our commodity cheese, of course. That's still one of the popular items. They used to have a grape juice, I remember, and I think it was just sugar water with purple food coloring. But you can see dried milk, dried egg mix, those types of foods. On the right, that big jar, you can see it says USDA food. That is a package of corn syrup. And if you look very carefully, it says use in baby formula. Now, corn syrup is also a processed food that is incredibly unhealthy. So when we combine things like corn syrup and shortening and processed bleached flour, basically there's no nutritional value, it's just empty calories. And the calories are also toxic. So the USDA inadvertently, I hope, actually has led to part of our health disparities, and recognizing that there's been an impact on the health of the population based on these incredibly unhealthy foods and the loss of food sovereignty. So how do we recapture and really study the healing effect of traditional foods and get away from these processed foods? So that's part of our research as well. In terms of the boarding schools, Dr. Ursula Runningbear, you'll hear from her later. She's looking at the impact of boarding school participation across generations and its impact on health and allostatic load and other measures of inflammation. Just fascinating research project from Dr. Runningbear. So you'll hear from each of those researchers later this afternoon on their specific projects and how it fits into this broader pattern of historical trauma and leading to chronic disease disparities. We also know that adverse childhood experiences have a negative impact on long-term health. And unfortunately, we have higher adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, in many of our populations. And unfortunately, adverse childhood experiences lead to chronic disease disparities. And this is from the CDC, the National Center for Injury Prevention, specifically the Domestic Violence Program. And what I'm really pleased with out of the CDC is that the ACE pyramid used to have adverse childhood experiences at the base. That was considered the base of the pyramid. But they've expanded this out and recognized that social conditions in a community and the local context put some populations at greater risk for adverse childhood experiences, things like abuse and neglect and household dysfunction. But CDC has taken it one step further and actually says very clearly, generational embodiment and historical trauma can put some communities at greater risk for the social conditions that lead to adverse childhood experiences. And what we see with adverse childhood experiences, again, abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, is that it has an impact on neurodevelopment, which has an impact on social, emotional, and cognitive development, then ultimately adoption of health risk behaviors, early onset of disease, and early death. And I think it's important to recognize that much of the challenges that we face are directly linked to the historical trauma. But when we look at adverse childhood experiences, what's fascinating is we see a dose response. The more adversity in childhood, the worse the health status is during adulthood. So just fascinating outcomes, higher rates of things like obesity, diabetes, suicide, heart disease, and even infectious disease. And then higher rates of self-medication with smoking, drug use, alcohol, and then a direct impact on life potential, lower graduation rates, higher unemployment, and higher rates of poverty. So adverse childhood experiences shows a very direct dose response. The more adversity in childhood, the worse the outcomes as adults. So trauma has an impact on the brain, and many of us are very aware of this in terms of understanding neurological development and neurophysiology. And stress hormones are released by the brain and travel throughout the body. And normally other hormones travel back to the brain to offset the effect of the stress hormones. But in chronic stress, that gets dysfunctional, and we see persistent arousal or hyperarousal. So people who are living under toxic stress have that constant fight or flight response and behavior. But we also know that high levels of things like cortisol can increase blood sugar, and high levels of adrenaline or epinephrine can increase blood pressure. So this is bad for our health when we see toxic stress in a community. And unfortunately for children, we can see irritability, trouble sleeping, trouble with social connections, withdrawn nature. And unfortunately, the children quite often are kind of labeled as problem children, right? But it's not their fault if they're dealing with these types of traumas. So we just have to be better as a health system to identify these challenges, understand the impact of trauma, but more importantly, identifying solutions to do something about it. So the adversity does not end at age 18. Unfortunately, we still see adverse adulthood experiences with high rates of substance abuse. We have high rates of suicide, high rates of death generally. Living in poverty is stressful, and lots of toxic stress in our communities. And children who grow up with adversity and abuse eventually become parents, right? And what have they learned about parenting? So we have a huge pattern of health disparities within this framework, but we can look at this and recognize that in many ways it's daunting, it's depressing, it can create a lot of anger. But in truth, it's also a multitude of areas in which we can intervene. We can do something about much of this. We don't have to see ongoing adverse childhood experiences. We don't have to embrace unhealthy foods. We don't have to continue to live in toxic stress. And perhaps there's ways in which we can develop new programming that's unique to Indigenous populations to address these disparities. Just very briefly, I'll mention one of the studies that I was a co-principal investigator on, the South Dakota Health Survey. And we engaged every county in South Dakota, and 7 of the 9 tribes agreed to participate. So it was really good participation in the South Dakota Health Survey. And we had about 8,000 respondents to the survey, and of that number, over 500 American Indians in the state. So we basically cut and pasted from other validated surveys, including BRFIS, and we did also mental health screening, so not self-reported mental health challenges, but actually screening, things like the PHQ-2 for depression, the GAD-2 for generalized anxiety disorder, Audit-C for alcohol use disorder. And then we also assessed access to services, and we collected data on adverse childhood experiences. So we did get ACE scores. So again, over 8,000 surveys completed across the state, and of that number, well over 500 American Indian. So the demographics of the subject population did reflect the statewide demographics. So American Indians are much younger than the non-American Indian population. Our birth rates are higher, but our death rates are also higher. So we have less elders. So we have a younger population. And also similar patterns from what we see from census data in terms of higher rates of poverty and other social challenges. Well, these are the results from the adverse childhood experiences data. I'm sorry, no, this is from the social and demographic data. So again, more unemployment, lower income, and lower educational attainment. And our sample, our data set, population was very consistent with statewide trends from census data. So this is looking at screening for mental health conditions, and these were all statistically significant. I know it's a busy slide, but if we look at the lighter blue bars and on the far right of each grouping, we had statistically significantly higher screening for depression with the PHQ-2, anxiety with the GAD-2, and also higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder among American Indians living on reservations. Here's the data from the ACE component of the study. And unfortunately, for each of the 10 domains of adverse childhood experiences, there was statistically significantly worse exposure to abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. So again, just very, very sad, very depressing data. But at the same time, it also tells us that there are things we can do about this, that we don't have to have ongoing intergenerational adverse childhood experiences, that we should be intervening and promoting our cultural connectedness to overcome some of these challenges. So not surprisingly, since each individual ACE score was significantly worse, the overall ACE score was also significantly worse for American Indians. And it's amazing if you look at those who had no adverse childhood experiences, it was only 17% of American Indians responded with 0 ACE score, whereas half the non-American Indian population had no adverse childhood experiences. I'd call your attention, nearly 20% of American Indians had 6 or more adverse childhood experiences. So just remarkable data set, unfortunately. Okay, let's see. Yeah, we'll have time for questions here at the end. And actually, I'll go ahead and pause right here and see, Dr. Nguyen, I know you have your hand up. Would you, if we could have Dr. Nguyen ask his question, that would be great.
And I had my hand up by accident, but I very much enjoyed the presentation.
All right, thank you so much. Appreciate that, Dean Nguyen. Just really appreciate you being here as well. All right, so just thinking about different perspectives on trauma. Again, we can think about physical trauma, psychological and emotional trauma, but also spiritual and cultural trauma. And we know that these have a negative impact on health. But even more importantly, I think there are cultural solutions to address the challenges that we're facing. And I think that we can combine cultural interventions with modern scientific interventions in a much more holistic way. And we're starting to see some preliminary data from other centers that show the power of even social connectedness. We know that social isolation has a negative impact on health, whereas social connectedness has a positive impact on health. And that's part of what we would do traditionally and culturally, the whole idea of mitakuye oyasi, which means we are all related or we are all connected. It was recognized that that's a basic tenet of health, is that connectedness to one another. We also know that movement is important for health, not just physical health, but also emotional health, right? That we should be involved in exercise or movement. Now, historically, we didn't necessarily have exercise programs because it was a very challenging life just physically and surviving. There was a lot of physical activity. But I think with more sedentary lifestyles, it's having a negative impact on holistic health as well. Historically, we had our own processes for meditation and mindfulness. And I think there's some exciting opportunities to look at how we can combine cognitive behavioral therapy and indigenous perspectives on mindfulness. We know that when people are mindful and focused on things that they are grateful for, it has a positive impact on physiology. Whereas when people are dwelling on things that are negative, it can have an impact on stress hormones, negative impact on blood pressure and blood sugar. And that's part of our traditional healing, is being mindful and grateful. And when I see some of the fascinating opportunities to look at stress management and resiliency training and other programs, from my perspective, that really is consistent with our traditional medicine areas of focus on being grateful and having a morning prayer, daily focus on what we are grateful for. So the whole idea of prayer and reconnection needs to be a part of the solution for Indigenous populations. So as we move forward with our research center, these are the things that we want to address. And recognizing that for recovery as individuals and as communities, this involves a holistic approach. And I'm just very pleased with NIH and being open to these ideas of culturally based approaches and recognizing the importance of cultural connectedness and ceremony in our recovery process and healing process. And just looking at the word recovery, the root of that is cover, right? And historically for Great Plains and other tribes, we used blankets for healing and blankets for ceremony, and recognizing that there's a warmth and a healing nature of being covered. So what we need is that recovery process. And we do this for graduates. On the left, that's South Dakota State University for nursing. On the right, that's North Dakota State University, some MPH graduates. And just within the last couple of weeks, we had our InMed, Indians into Medicine, and Health Sciences graduates at UND. And this is what we do now, is to try to promote wholeness and wellness among people that we're honoring, and recognizing that as we develop more Indigenous health scholars, we have the opportunity to expand this work and hopefully have meaningful outcomes. So just to kind of summarize my area of focus for this morning, we have significant social determinants of health, a lot of poverty and trauma, and terrible outcomes in terms of health disparities and inequities across income and education. So we need equity in a much more comprehensive focus that includes medical interventions, but also behavioral health interventions, public health interventions, and others. And I'm sure many have seen this particular image of looking at the difference between equality and equity. And in the focus on equality, everyone has the same package of services. Everyone gets the same curriculum. Everyone gets the same intervention. So with that equality focus, we can see that we still have underserved people, whereas equity, we're looking at outcomes. And we want everyone to achieve that level of wellness, even if that means we have to have unique programs and unique services. And we need to be more intelligent as systems to provide the services that are needed. And I had shown this image for a number of years. And a few years ago, a friend of mine sent me an image I think is just brilliant. And the question is, why is that wall there in the first place? You know, is it just about the package of services to overcome the barrier, or do we need to get rid of the systemic barrier? And I think part of the systemic barrier that we faced is a lack of culturally focused research and interventions. And again, we take a one size fits all. We say that, well, this particular intervention worked effectively in the underserved population of Boston and New York City. Well, does that mean it's going to work in Pine Ridge or Navajo Nation? Well, it might and it might not. We have to be much more intelligent about this and make sure that the interventions we design and that we assess are culturally relevant. And even if that means taking some unique approaches. So our program at UND for Indigenous Health, we have a new Department of Indigenous Health. I'll talk more about that this afternoon. We have our Indians into Medicine program, or InMed. We've now graduated over 260 American Indian Alaska Native physicians. For Indigenous Health, we have both an MPH and a PhD program. Again, I'll talk more about that this afternoon. And then what we're focusing on today is the Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center. So we're looking at measures of stress from trauma, but also measures of resilience. We're looking at adverse childhood experiences, but also culture as a protective measure. And then the impact of traditional foods on nutritional epigenetics. So this is funded through National Institute of General Medical Sciences, NIGMS, and they fund what's called the Institutional Development Awards. So they have CTRs, or Clinical and Translational Research Centers, COBREs, Centers of Biomedical Research Excellence, which are focused on faculty development, and INBREs, which are the Idea Network for Biomedical Research Excellence, and that's student development. So the IDEA states, or Institutional Development Award states, are the states that are historically underfunded by NIH. So it clearly includes where we are here in the Dakotas. And our Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center is a COBRE, so it's focused on faculty development. And early afternoon, we'll hear from our three early career scholars that are focusing on this work. So welcome to all of you. Just so honored to have you as part of these important discussions looking at Indigenous trauma and resilience. Up next, we'll hear from Dr. David Wilson, who is the director of the Tribal Health Research Office at NIH. And then we'll hear from Dr. Allison Kelleher, who's on faculty with us, and she's director of our American Indian Collaborative Research Network. We'll have a brief break for lunch, and then the afternoon, we'll hear from our individual project researchers, Drs. Williams, Running Bear, and Redvers. And then we'll have a presentation from Dr. Amanda Fretz, who will give us an overview of the Strong Heart Study and updates and how we might be able to link to some of their data sets. All right, thank you so much. And I'll see if there's any questions or comments perhaps, and then I'll hand it off to Dr. Wilson. But perhaps, let's see, we have a hand up. Mary, if we can go ahead and let you ask your question or have your comment.
You should be unmuted now, Mary, if you'd like to ask your question.
Maybe not. Let's see. And Dr. Nguyen, do you have your hand up again as well?
Well, this time it was intentional. Thank you.
Okay, very good.
One of the things you pointed out is an insufficient number of role models and mentors. What can we collectively do about that?
Excellent point. And one of the things we'll talk about this afternoon as we close up is I'll provide an update of what we're doing here in terms of our Department of Indigenous Health, and we have our PhD in Indigenous Health. We're also growing our numbers of Indigenous scholars that are here. And I think we're just so pleased. We have quite a number of Indigenous people who are conducting research and teaching courses and serving as role models. But I think it's a model that could be replicated at other universities. I'd love to see more universities focusing on Indigenous health as an academic discipline, but also looking at Indigenous medicine as a clinical science. I think there's a whole arena of work that could be done, and certainly we could help lead that way. So, and also just in front of the whole audience, just thank you so much, Dean Nguyen, for being so supportive of these efforts.
Yes, Tess.
All right. Let's see, and Mary, if you had a question, I think you can be unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thanks. Really appreciate the day you're spending on Indigenous trauma and resilience. Something I've been recently working on in my community is developing community resilience, which is a small community in northern Minnesota. But my question is about, I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but I was wondering, you talked about your research. I'm wondering if do you have a citation? Has it been published yet? Is there some place where I could read more about the research that you're doing?
Absolutely. So we'll hear from each of the three research project leaders this afternoon, but also some of the things that I cited are published. I'll put those in the chat so everyone will have access to those as well.
Thank you much.
All right, you're welcome. All right, well, I'm deeply honored to hand it off to my good friend, Dr. David Wilson. Dr. Wilson and I have known each other since our Arizona State University days many years ago, and I'm just so pleased and honored with his hard work at NIH and really putting tribal health research at the forefront of priorities. So again, we're just so deeply honored to have you with us, Dr. Wilson. I'll go ahead and hand it off to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Warren. Let's see here. Let me share my screen so that we can get going. And thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this first annual conference. And I think that Dr. Warren, you laid such a terrific foundation and setting the stage for all of the future speakers to come to follow. What I want to do is to offer up what we're currently doing at the NIH and talk about how we're including or how we're hoping to develop a more holistic approach to how biomedical research can provide some of the answers to improve health in many of our tribal communities and all of our tribal communities. So you laid the way very nicely. You talked about the importance of the recognition of social determinants of health, which are also an absolute critical feature that we need to be aware of when we think about developing programs or developing policies or creating initiatives. So with that, I'd like to do a brief introduction about the NIH itself. So as many of you know, this program, the COBRE program, and all the different programs that Dr. Warren talked about, they're funded by the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. And our mission here is to seek the fundamental knowledge about the nature of living systems, about how everything works and how everything comes together. This is something that our tribal communities have done for centuries, but now we're trying to do it in a different context. We're trying to be able, we're doing this in a different approach, in a different way. And one of the things that we're doing at the NIH is how do we include both our traditional learnings and knowledge, but also leverage what we're learning from our research at the NIH. And I think together we would be able to synergize the overall positive outcomes and effects if we work together in addressing the health disparities that continue to persist in tribal communities. But our overall goal here is just to really improve, to enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability. And that's really what a lot of our communities are begging for as well. So at the NIH, we are all a big part of the Department of Health and Human Services. And here you can see all of our sister operating divisions within HHS. And we work closely with the Indian Health Service, with HRSA, with FDA, with CMS, CDC. That collaboration is really beginning to take off. SAMHSA, ACF, and I'm sure you've heard of all of these different parts of HHS, but now it's great to have the opportunity to give you a little deeper insight into what we do at the NIH. So the NIH, it's really important to recognize that we have two parts. We're basically divided into two big parts, which is the intramural part and the extramural part for our research programs. Our intramural part is just a very, very small part of what the agency does here. So the overall budget that we have is around $43 billion, and that's the largest amount of funding that goes to research in the world. And here you can see that just a small part of that, 11% of the NIH's budget, goes to the intramural research component of our agency. And then the rest of the funding goes out to investigators like Dr. Warren and his team and other institutions across the world. And it's really, you can see here that we receive more than 50,000 competitive grants a year. And you can see here that we review over 70,000 applications. So there's 40,000 awards go out annually. So there's a tremendous amount of funding that goes out to really be able to try to answer some of these tough issues related to our health that have been long-standing for a long period of time. So some of the things that we really base the agency bases the decisions on funding on are, and what we really try to do is to develop major initiatives that foster and accelerate our understanding of how things work and how things operate, to be able to develop those interventions to improve health. And you can see here on this slide that the funding decisions are made based on their scientific merit. So we have a group of peer reviewers who are experts in their field come in and review to see if the science is solid. Also, is there an opportunity? Does this particular project address a specific need in the community? Public health needs, right there, you see that. And then also, is this something that we are currently funding in our portfolio of work, or is this where we can be able to identify and fill a gap with these specific research projects? And so those are some of the criteria that we use at the NIH to determine where the grants go and how health disparities are addressed. So for our work at the NIH, some of the things that we've really been doing since we stood up the office. So the office was created in 2015. I was appointed the director in 2017. And what we've really been doing first and foremost is educating not only the NIH, but really trying to educate the broader scientific community about the importance of sovereignty, recognizing that tribes are sovereign nations and that these are a result of the land that we've given up during the colonization of America. And as a result, we have a very unique relationship with the federal government. It's a government to government relationship. It's very different. It's not a race or ethnicity issue. It's a political status. It's a legal and political difference, a relationship with the government. So it's very different. Also, something that's critically important that we really communicate is that there are 574 federally recognized tribes, which means that there's a tremendous amount of diversity. You know, my dear friend, Dr. Warren, and I come from two different communities, but we share a lot of commonalities. And I think that that's really something that we're all doing together to help address and move science forward so that we can begin to think about and see results in our communities around some of these health disparities. Also, it's critical to kind of lay out where all of the tribes are. And sometimes there's a misnomer because people think about a lot of tribes being all over the place, but you can see there's a tremendous number of villages in Alaska, 231 federally recognized villages and 109 in California. So there's not equal distribution, but that doesn't mean that there's not equal need across the spectrum. And so we really try to show our federal partners and our research scientists at the NIH when they go to specific areas, and we've helped them identify regions of need by actually using the IHS service area map. Here you can see the different colors represent different areas of the IHS service area map. So when we talk about servicing the Albuquerque area, people know that that's the New Mexico and Colorado region. And when we talk about Portland, they know that those are the Pacific Northwest states. So it helps us better identify where some of our particular programs and initiatives might be launching or taking place or being supported. So this is a really important map that we use at the NIH to help communicate where everybody's at and what we're doing. So I wanted to take a little bit of a shift and talk about that. As we all know, the last couple of years we've really seen a tremendous amount of shift and change, not only in terms of the COVID-19 experience, but also in terms of the agency perspectives, the agency priorities. The Biden administration has really put forth front and center they're wanting federal agencies to have increased engagement and dialogue with tribal communities. And this all goes back to what Dr. Warren had mentioned about equity. It's really important to think about how equity will play a role in improving the health of not only American Indians and Alaska Natives, but also other underrepresented community members across the country. A lot of the things that we've seen happening in our society in terms of social justice movements, and also at the NIH as well, is that we've launched an effort that's called the Unite effort, and it's to end structural racism, or really to be able to identify the structural barriers that have led to that actually have prohibited our community members from wanting to participate in biomedical research. And so I'll talk more about this, but the changing landscape of our society has really helped our office become more effective and really help educate more of the scientific community about what our community means, what's the ethical and the appropriate way to engage our communities, to seek input about how we identify research priorities that are important for the communities, not necessarily important for the researcher or the investigator. Something else that's really been important that we've seen is that the Supreme Court has made some decisions as of late. You can see the decision here in 2020. And I won't go through the whole details here, but you can see what I want you to get out of this slide here is that the Supreme Court has recognized that tribal rights, sovereignty, and jurisdiction are really important by their ruling to state that more than half of Oklahoma still resides as Indian land, or is still recognized as Indian land. And so these are things that have really helped shape the way that we're addressing a lot of the issues in terms of biomedical research. Here you can see in greater detail some of the presidential memorandums and executive orders that have come out to support tribal engagement, to help us be more inclusive of tribal communities in all the federal work that we do across the government. So more specifically about our office, I had mentioned that we were established in 2015, but our office serves a unique role at the NIH. We serve as the coordinating hub for all the 27 institutes and centers at the NIH. And so with $43 billion coming in and going out to different grantees, you can see that there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen. And Our goal is also to really support the institutes and centers who have a strong commitment to supporting American Indian and Alaska Natives in biomedical research. We have several committees that do this. One of our committees is the NIH Tribal Health Research Coordinating Committee. It's the THRCC. And what we've done and what we've requested is a member from each of the 27 institutes and centers to sit on this committee and ask. It's a forum for us to be able to ask, what are the immediate needs of your specific research area? How can we help? And what are some of the things that you see on the horizon that we can all collaborate together to do this in a more unified approach? And so that committee is really important on how we are able to operate across the NIH to address tribal issues and needs. We also, our office, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, that we used to have the guidance for the implementation of the HHS tribal consultation policy, but that has all changed. I'll save that for a little bit later in the presentation, because that's really exciting news. But our office is also really acutely aware of that we really want to have tribal input in terms of when programs are being created, when programs are being designed, and also when programs are being implemented. And so that's one of our goals as well, is to gather meaningful input when all of these scenarios come together. And we also convene our NIH Tribal Advisory Committee, and these are elected or appointed leaders from across the country that represent each of those IHS service areas that I had identified earlier. They all are help us as an advisory committee to guide the agency's investment in terms of biomedical research for tribes. So they play a really important role. They are extremely active, and I will talk about some of the things that they're leading a little bit later. So coming into the office, it was critically important for us to develop a strategic plan for the agency. And so our office, in collaboration with all of our partners, and we did a national formal consultation with tribes to gather input from all the communities that wanted to participate. What we heard back were these 4 really big areas that our communities wanted to have addressed. Tribal communities wanted the agency to really enhance how they communicate and collaborate with tribal nations. They wanted us to focus on how we build research capacity for tribes to be able not only to participate in research, but also how they can be able to conduct research on their own. And also expanding research. How can we have access or provide opportunities to a wider breadth of disciplines? How can we participate in cardiovascular research and also in behavioral health research, or in nursing research, or in dental or cranial facial research? So these were all some of the outcomes. But I think most importantly is number 4, is that without thinking about cultural awareness and community engagement, then all of these other efforts would be not as effective as we really need them to be. And so number 4 is critically important for us to really include this in everything that we do, whether it's capacity building or whether it's communication collaboration. It has to be done this with our cultural awareness right in front and center. and so remember, this is not just a throw strategic plan. This is for the entire NIH. It's an agency-wide vision, and there's been a tremendous amount of work. We are currently developing a report that will actually capture all of the different initiatives, efforts that have been, and the policies that have been developed under this strategic plan, because later this year, we will be going to, again, back to consultation to receive more input, showing the tribal nations what we've done and what are some of the things that we still need to do. So, and there's still quite a bit of work left to do. So we're looking forward to that engagement this summer and leading into the fall, that will help shape the next strategic plan that will be implemented in 2023, that will go to 2029. So I quickly want to touch over some of the activities that we've done to address or to meet some of these goals that I've mentioned. So goal number 1, enhancing communication and collaboration. This really came to the forefront during the early days of the pandemic. And what we've done and what we did was our our office became a 24/7 operation. It was critically important for us to be able to provide our tribal communities, our tribal councils, and our tribal health departments accurate and up-to-date information on how the vaccines were being developed, how they were being tested, and what were some of the things that they were seeing in terms of side effects, efficacy. So these were all things that were really important to the tribes. And I think that with other partners, we were able to do this very effectively, where tribes really had a sense of where they knew exactly where to come to get that accurate and up-to-date information. So that was during the pandemic. We've also really began to create more awareness across the community through different platforms. In the past, many of us were gathering in person because that was the best way to do it. That was the most respectful way to engage. But now more tribal communities have been more open to the virtual platforms, to platforms like Facebook Live. And this has really helped us allow more tribal communities to provide input on, or to receive messages, accurate messages related to the COVID-19 pandemic, but also related to other types of research. So here you can see we did an interview with Dr. Fauci, and it was very well received. And we are doing, based on this, it really created our thought, made us think about different ways to create more awareness in our tribal communities about the research that was being supported at the NIH. And as a result, you can see here that we've begun different engagements with different institute directors talking about how they support tribal communities in biomedical research. And these are all available on our NIH Tribal Health Research Office website. So if you're interested, you can hear my conversation with Dr. Josh Gordon, who is the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, where he will talk about what is the research is being supported, but what are some of the things that we're seeing as we begin to emerge out of, or to come out of, the pandemic. And also Dr. Nora Volkow, who is the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse. She's been a long-time supporter of tribal communities, and she shares some really wonderful perspectives, and she thinks it's critically important for our community members to really recognize our tribal members who are grappling with substance misuse issues, that it's not a personal flaw, but it is a disease or a condition. And it's a chronic disease that we know that needs to be treated, and we need to treat it as such, making sure that we're not looking at the individual, but looking at more, focusing on the disease and how we can help our tribal members heal. So those are some of the great things, but also it was really important for us to meet goal number 2, is that we really need to understand where we were starting from. In order to build research capacity, we had to understand where we were starting. And so as a result, we developed and we published the first 2 NIH research portfolios. And this really helped us understand how the investment was being placed in tribal communities. Where was it going? What kind of research was being funded? And we're getting ready to release the 3rd version, which will be from years 2019 to 2020. And we're thinking about this. It's been an evolving process because the grants that the NIH issues are usually 4 years in duration. So having a report out year after year may not be as useful because you won't see those big changes in where we've been placing investments. But I think that we're going to go to a biannual report that will give us a better look at that, and how the agency investment is proceeding. So this is what I really wanted to focus on, and I think this is where we've really begun to help hear tribal community perspectives that help the agency develop, create more effective programs for tribal communities. And this is through the NIH Tribal Consultation Policy. And I missed a little thing up here, that no longer is this policy a draft. This policy has been fully implemented as of March 13th. So the NIH has a new NIH Tribal Consultation Policy that's very specific for biomedical research, and it complements the HHS Tribal Consultation Policy, which all the operating divisions focus on. And this has been really important because, again, this is what consultation is, it's an enhanced form of communication. So it's the opportunity for tribal leaders to meet with the highest officials, highest level officials at the NIH to discuss what are the positive parts of a program, policy, or initiative, or what needs to be looked more closely at or needs to be changed to be more inclusive of tribal communities as these programs, policies, or initiatives get closer to being launched. And that's really what we want to do, is to have more tribal input on the front end before these programs are launched, so they're most effective when they go out the door. You can see here that we have actually been actively refining how we engage with tribal communities. Each of the different consultations that we've had have really been a wonderful learning experience about how we can do this better, how we can be more responsive to tribal communities. And that you'll see is reflected in our policy. But some of the things you can see here, the consultation topics that we've had have been, many of them have been proposed by the community, but also by our NIH Tribal Advisory Council, where they said, you know, Dave, we really want to think about how opioids are really taking a hold of our communities. What are some of the programs or initiatives that are being funded, and how can we direct those more to our communities in a way that will be beneficial? Also, we've heard from tribal leaders about we're interested in participating in biomedical research, but we are not sure how the intellectual property issue equates to biomedical research. So can we have a consultation on what's the NIH do and how does it fulfill its role, and what is its interpretation in terms of intellectual property and biomedical research? And so these have been very well attended and very well received opportunities for the communities to hear about the process. Tribes should be engaged very early on when negotiating agreements between the individuals who receive the grant and how intellectual property will be handled if something significant comes out a result of the research that's being conducted with the communities. Some of the other things that we've had most currently here, you see, and this is something that I'm really hoping that our communities will be very open to, is there's the RADX initiative on the Data Tribal Repository, or it's called the RADX TDR. This is really important because this is a unique opportunity for tribes to be able to submit grants, to be able to manage, or to be able to oversee the operational function of a tribal data repository. This repository will only house or store data that's relevant to COVID-19 research that's funded under the RADX program, but it's really a starting point for our communities to be able to think about how do we want to share data and how should data be used so that it's represented and it's published ethically to benefit our communities so that we can reduce stigmatizing our community members or our communities as a whole, but be able to really benefit from the research that our communities are actively participating or contributing to. So this is the first, and I think that, you know, this is the first initiative of its kind, and it's going to be a learning process, and I'm really excited to see what comes out of this. Something else that's critically important and is a huge priority of our office and also at the NIH is building the next generation of American Indian and Alaska Native research scientists. And we have several programs at the NIH, and right now we're undertaking a large effort to be able to coordinate all the research opportunities that exist at the NIH as we're beginning to go back to a more normal state of what we remember life being, is that we're now really beginning to coordinate what are some of the opportunities that we can provide to more American Indian Alaska Native students, not only to come to the NIH, but we're also developing regional training hubs. So these regional training hubs, we have 3 of them right now in the Pacific Northwest, 1 in the Southwest, and 1 in the Great Plains. They allow students who are juniors and seniors in high school to go to a partnering facility and be able, with community support and engagement, be able to get a really good understanding of what biomedical research is and how it can benefit our communities. But also, if they choose to take that next step and come to the NIH, then they'll have a good understanding of what is the level of expectation around research. You know, what am I going to learn and how should I think about going to this? Because it is a big change. It's a big change from coming from our communities, going to this world cutting edge research facility or research agency. But when you come into the NIH, we do really important things, like not only will you be able to participate in research and research that's important to you, but also we take our students down to the Hill. You can see here, we took students down to meet Representative Sharice Davids, and the students were able to share some of the important health issues that they were concerned about, why they were interested in biomedical research. And this is important for our members to hear about because they're the ones that support our agency budget. And it's also important for our students to understand how the NIH is funded and how that whole research continuum operates and functions. So I wanted to talk about some of the efforts that we're doing in terms of cutting edge things. And one of those is the data sharing and data management policy. So this is a brand new policy that's going to be agency wide. It's going to roll out let's see here, in 2023 of January. Yes, 2023. And this is really important because the NIH, and I'm going to put the RFI link in the chat so that everybody has access to it. But if you have, you can read what the draft version looks like. The draft version was created by our Office of Science Policy in collaboration with our NIH Tribal Advisory Committee. And they worked together to develop this draft guidance of things that we need to be very cognizant of as researchers when including tribes and tribal data in biomedical research. So this is going to be really important about recognizing and how we reduce the unethical use of data from our communities, but also how we get the most benefit from that data from biomedical research. So if you have recommendations or additions, I will send the link to you. The request for information closes on the 28th of this month. So you still have a couple of days left to submit any recommendations that you think need to be incorporated into this draft guidance before we begin to solidify it more. Expanding research, the goal number 4. This has been something that a lot of our agencies, our institutes and centers have really been excited about. And one of the things that we've done, which is really cutting edge and new for the NIH, is holding community listening sessions to get community input about what are some of the things that need to be looked at in order for us to destroy or to reduce the barriers for tribes to be able to participate in research. And here you can see this one up here that took place late last year, November 4th. We received a tremendous amount of input. But these are some of the things that will come, because this will be a transformative research initiative that will look specifically at addressing the health disparities to advance health equity for tribal communities. And I talked really at length about this. I had a slide up here as well. But this is a really important opportunity around the RADx Tribal Data Repository. We've already had that consultation. And I also want to talk a little bit more in depth about what Dr. Warren had talked about, which is, really thinking about how we can infuse and incorporate culture into the biomedical research process, because it's so important. It's very critical. One of the things that we've done, and Dr. Warren was a part of this, was to hold a traditional medicine summit. And this was where we brought together traditional healers to hear about their views and their perspectives on how science, Western science, and how traditional healing can come together, or if they could come together at all. And what we heard was absolutely that traditional ways really need to be recognized and acknowledged towards their efficacy. We've been practicing a lot of our traditional ways for centuries, but how can our ways of knowing and our knowledge be incorporated into traditional or to Western ways of healing to synergize and to further heal our communities. So this was a very well attended summit, and we've heard so much positive feedback that we're really thinking about what we might be able to do for a second traditional medicine summit, but there's more to come on that. So this continues the conversation, and this is something that we've really been looking at. And I'm sorry this slide is so busy, but this goes to our number 4 strategic priority again, is really educating the broader scientific community about how important it is to think about the holistic approach, but also thinking about how we incorporate culture and traditions into not only the policies that support research, but also how research is reviewed and how research is viewed by the different checks and balances that protect our communities. And those include NIH IRBs, but also tribal IRBs. What are the ethical responsibilities of the research community when reaching out to our communities as equal partners in biomedical research? And we do this not only through these particular initiatives. One of the things that we're working on that I think is going to be immensely impactful is we're currently developing guidance for the ethical inclusion of our urban Indian community members. And this is important because many of us realize that our urban community members are the most vulnerable community members because many of them live outside the jurisdictions of our tribal nations. And so it's really important that we have guidance that the scientific community can really look at to help not only include them to help address their health disparities, but also to make sure that they're protected as they participate or they conduct these research studies across the country. So we're hoping that our goal is to have this guidance out by Halloween of this year of 2022, but we will definitely keep everyone aware of how this is progressing. It's really important too that we get out publications and information in terms of white papers out into the scientific community, because as we know, many of the scientific community, this is the currency in our communities, is our publications. And so the more that we get out, the more information that people are able to read and use as guidance as they continue to engage our communities in biomedical research. Now, the next slide is a wonderful treat here. I think you all recognize who we have in the slide here, is that we also really go out to engage our scientific community at the NIH, but across the country through our Native American Heritage Month activities. And this was a really wonderful event that we had last year. It's recorded on our website that you can hear Dr. Warren talk about the interconnectedness of culture and science. This was a wonderful event. We've continued this, and we've had many wonderful speakers who have helped identify different areas of research that we really need to be cognizant of. So this is something that I wanted to show, and I think this really captures some of the more holistic ways that our office has really been engaged in our communities. And it's something for you to think about if you're a research scientist, if you're a student, if you're a member of the community and you're watching this, that what we really wanted to do during the pandemic and how we were able to bring tribes into this whole process of vaccine development, clinical trial participation, and increase the vaccine uptake in the communities is, you can see the bubble here on the far right that's in between tribal nations and clinical trials, is that our ultimate goal was not to increase the number of tribes participating, but just to increase the number of tribes who had the opportunity to make the decision on whether they wanted to participate or not. And being able to identify what were some of the things that they felt uncomfortable about that would limit their participation or limit their decision to want to receive the vaccine. And so with that mentality going in, we brought in and we developed community committees that were around, they would call them community panels. And what they did is they were able to review the research protocols that came in, provide comments that they were adapted by the sponsoring, the vaccine sponsor. And then those protocols were then put out into the general population or into the public. And those kinds of messages and that kind of engagement really helped, I think, more communities really be able to trust the science and to be able to trust the process, you know, because this was such an unprecedented event and because things were happening so fast. And it was so important for us to really be aware of everything that was happening. Things were changing by the hour. And so it was important for us to have this really important connection with the communities, not only the communities, but also the tribal leaders. I was involved in many of the tribal councils and had conversations with the councils about what was happening and really was able to share on them. Actually, Dr. Fauci was in a closed session consultation or council meeting with several of the Great Plains councils. And so we really wanted to include tribal communities. This is an evolving culture at the NIH, and I think it's really going to benefit our communities, and it has in the short term. Some of the highlights you can see here that we've done are been really important. I want to be cognizant of the time and save some time for some questions. So I will go through these. So this is a critically important slide here that I wanted to show to everybody that, you know, when we first started the office, when the NIH first stood up the Thoreau office, the annual investment for tribal health research was around 180 million. And you can see here that through our combined efforts across the NIH, through everybody coming together and really doing this as a team, you can see how much that has increased. In 2020 here, the investment in tribal health research was at around $310 million, and that is projected to grow even more and more. So these are phenomenal increases, and they're going to really pay out as our tribes begin to be more involved in the biomedical or in the clinical trial process. Something that we also do for our communities is we also think, you know, we also reframe this question, you know, for our communities, what areas do you hope to be involved with? And when we think about all the different programs that we create, that we put out, right here, this quote here that I think many of us are aware of is that we now have to really think about what we do now and how it impacts our future generations. And with going into that, we know that we play a critical role in this together, because we've seen what the past, where we're starting from, but we really want to set the tone for everything moving forward. And some of the things that we've done most recently is that we've had a lot of interest from tribal communities about their participation in what we call the post-acute sequelae for COVID-19 studies. That's better understanding the symptoms of long COVID and how that impacts our community members' health. So better understanding that will help us create interventions that will help our community members recover after they have become infected with COVID-19. We're also actively engaged in Indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge efforts with the White House, with the administration. So right now we're developing guidance on how Indigenous knowledge can be used to shape and develop federal programs moving forward. We're also very much involved in food sovereignty issues. You'll be hearing more about that later today. That diet and nutrition are going to be critically important on how we confront and address not only diabetes, but cardiovascular issues, and I think mental health issues as well. Those are all a part of who we are as a result of what we eat. So with that, I want to say, I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you some of the things that are happening in the Tribal Health Research Office. You know, here is my contact information. Please visit our website. There's a tremendous amount of information there. And with that, I will stop and hand it back over to Dr. Warren to answer any questions the audience may have.
Yeah, so are there any questions from audience members? Please feel free to use the chat function. And I think Dr. Beiswinger can help in coordinating some of the discussion as well.
Yes, it looks like we have a question from Kathy. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi. Yes, one of the things that I was interested in, I do a lot of outreach, trying to get some of our younger students. I mean, I start even at pre-K. I've had as young as 21 months old through teaching graduate school level, involved into the sort of pipeline. And one of the things that I wondered about is that the programs and the outreach that you have, is there a way to sort of tag along with that to make the connection? Sometimes the biggest problem is one doesn't always have the advance notice to be able to go out to meet everyone, you know, a year or two in advance to make sure everyone's comfortable. Sometimes the grant appears in your email and it's due. And I do a lot of, I review healthcare systems for NASA right now, and I tried to, there are a lot of programs that come out of there. Is there a way to sort of get on a list or make that connection with you to be able to reach out to the even younger students so we get more students ready to be in that internship program? In other words, to network a little bit more, because you've already made some inroads and to say, hey, you know, we also have someone interested in starting very young so that the kids have an opportunity. I've designed some programs. I did won a big repeating grant for NASA and actually had my salary made into a scholarship, but I never was able to get the data back to help other programs. You know, I heard anecdotally that it did very well. And then when I went back to one of the reservations I lived on as a young doctor, I had an opportunity to go back 30 years later, and I started a club, and all my babies had gone on to college in a place that maybe in 1 or 2 years a couple might have gone. But also I've had the experience where, you know, you get everything set up, but then people don't know you well enough, and, you know, it's that kind of thing. And so I'd love to get sort of networked in a system that maybe you've made some of the connections and I can say, hey, can we start these programs and even help some of your babies that you're, you know, sorry, I shouldn't say that, some of our younger researchers that are in the biomedical research system that maybe would be interested in showing them ways of reaching back. I'm using some kids, some young adults in for example, from Lockheed Martin. I'm teaching them how to mentor, and we're doing Zooms to reach out to kids across the country. At any rate, I'd like to be part of this, just that outreach, because we need to have kids in the pipeline.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And there are opportunities. And so our office also serves as a single point of contact for all our extramural engagements, whether it come from the NIH or our sister operating divisions or academic institutions. So, you know, we would be happy to, you know, connect you and link you up. We also have a program called the Science and Education Partnership Award, or SEPA. And their focus is on K through 12 enrichment activities for science and education. And it would be great. And we've been thinking about how we can connect that, because that has been a program, a very effective, longstanding program that has resided in the National Institute of General Medical Sciences that we have yet to be able to tap into, not because of it's not important, but just because there's so many other things that we're doing right now, and we are a pretty small office. But you're absolutely right in engaging those successful programs and being able to continue to have consistent communication with those students that did display and did voice that they had interest in becoming a research scientist, making sure that they have those opportunities as they matriculate through the educational system, so they have that opportunity. You know, we really want, and we're really focused on bringing up the next Dr. Warren's and everyone else, all the other great researchers that are on today's panel. So thanks for the question, Kathy.
May I just interject real quickly? This is interesting. A couple of years before COVID, England actually did a study, and I belong to the Association of American Indian Physicians, and ideally, if you want to have a young person go into medicine, ideally you should capture them by the age of 7. So just to throw that out there.
I think we have a question from Andrew Williams.
Hey, Dr. Wilson. I teach in the PhD program here at UND, and in the next year to 18 months, we'll be having our first graduates, hopefully, fingers crossed. And in terms of NIH's focus of getting new researchers trained and out working in community or on Indigenous issues, are there any specific initiatives kind of under the works or that are available right now for whether it's extramural or intramural opportunities for postdocs that are Indigenous and working in their communities to gain that expertise and then eventually hopefully, you know, move on to faculty positions and, you know, maybe even other positions within NIH?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we would highly encourage, you know, Dr. Williams, if you could send me an email message and we can explore what funding mechanism you're currently funded under. There are supplements, you know, that we might be able to explore in terms of supporting a postdoc if they wanted to stay there in South Dakota or North Dakota, or if they wanted to come to the NIH, depending upon their area of research, whether it's cancer or heart, lung, and blood. So again, this is that unified approach. So thank you for the question, and we would be happy. And even if it's just an opportunity for the students to get exposure to a different type of research, you know, I think that that's also a high probability that we could help coordinate.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll be in touch because there is a supplement that we're interested in applying for this fall.
Looks like there's a couple more questions. Sandy Bates, I've unmuted you.
Good morning. My question concerns sustainability in moving the project forward. We understand that the current administration is very supportive of the NIH, but we also know that past administrations have severely cut funding. What type of process is being built into this system to make it sustainable without possibly having as much funding as you currently have?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thank you, Sandy, for that. So what I can say is that we will continue to develop the programs and the policies and the initiatives that continue to be more inclusive of tribal communities. As you saw the level of increase in funding, that's not a specific increase in agency funding that has been specifically directed to tribes. That's just better coordination across the agency. And so there are many, many more institute centers and offices that have yet to really jump in with both feet into the tribal arena. So I think that there's just greater potential for us to continue without receiving any specific funding that's directed towards tribal communities. So I think that there's a lot that we can do and a lot that will grow before we come up to that issue or that position where, you know, funding might be an issue or a problem.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question from Tanya Connor.
Thank you. I am an Indigenous Health PhD student at North Dakota, University of North Dakota. I have a two-part question. Given how important cultural competency and community engagement is for research with tribal communities and how diverse our communities are, how does NIH authenticate that researchers and peer reviewers have cultural competency and authentic connections with communities? What is the measure of this? And secondly, how can students and emerging researchers develop themselves to become an NIH peer reviewer?
Yeah, thank you, Tanya. Those are really good questions. So I will start with the last one. So we have a Center for Scientific Review, and they have an emerging researcher program that I can forward you the link to. And what they do is that they identify emerging research scientists, and they give them that opportunity to serve on study sections so that they can really get a good sense of how grants are reviewed, but also what are some of the things that reviewers are looking for to increase the likelihood that you would be successful when you get to that phase in your career where you're submitting grants for funding for particular projects for tribal communities. Addressing your first question around how do we authenticate relationships, that is a greater challenge. So many of our institutes and centers, when they develop these funding opportunities, they are now including, some of them are including that requirement to build in that community engagement. Like if you look at the NIH funding announcement, within that announcement, they specifically say that you need to submit letters of support from the communities that you're proposing to work with. And not only that, some of them go beyond that, that you need to provide a letter from the tribal IRB that shows that they support these projects moving forward. Now, whether that translates to the community, that's another question. And that's where our office is actually poised to respond, that if we hear issues or concerns from the community, then we try to follow up and see what is happening and where might the disconnect be, to figure out what's going on to make that research more beneficial and to improve the research experience for the communities.
Yeah, it looks like we don't have any more questions. Last chance if anyone does have any questions. All right, thank you very much, Dr. Wilson, for informative talk.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity.
All right, and next on the agenda, we have Dr. Allison Kelleher. She's Kukan Athabaskan and the founding director of the American Indian Collaborative Research Network. And she'll be presenting on research considerations for traditional medicine and practice-based research networks.
Thanks so much, Christina. I really appreciate it. Dahatne, good morning, everyone. Allison Kelleher, se uza tlege hutana etzlan, tuni zagatsitni te hutana etzlan, dan lahedo hutan sudan salet. I'm originally from Alaska. I introduced myself in Danakanaga. I'm still learning. And we're from the middle Yukon River, though I was born and raised in Nome. I'm so honored to be here speaking with you. I've been working with the University of North Dakota for years in collaboration, but relocated to UND to help direct the practice-based research network last summer. So I'm going to talk story around the practice-based research network, what exactly that alphabet soup means, and also share story about traditional healing, which is a passion of mine within the research arena. I'm really excited about this new graphic element for the American Indian Collaborative Research Network, our PBRN, based here out of UND Grand Forks. I'm affiliated with the Department of Community and Family Medicine and also the Department of Indigenous Health. I want to acknowledge the lands that you're visiting us from. So just taking a moment to acknowledge those caretakers of the lands where you are. I'm trained as a family and integrative physician. I have intramural and extramural research. I used to look at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and Institute of Arctic Biology. We used Arctic ground squirrels' ability to hibernate as a model of tolerance to stroke and cerebral ischemia. And I also worked on a project that was a sister project to the Strong Heart study, the Gokadan study, genetics of coronary artery disease in Alaska Natives. So that's some of my research background. But my traditional healing background started pre-kindergarten when I was around 4 and started having enough heft to walk on backs and carry on in my mother's family's traditional healing heritage. So started at quite a young age, training from elders and in other ways to become a traditional healer. I've apprenticed with healers globally and also from the Alaska Native and Native American perspective, and practiced medicine full spectrum and full time up until the last year, transitioning back to research, realizing that public health one-on-one isn't necessarily my cup of tea or the best way that I thought to apply my knowledge and experience. So want to be an advocate for research and Indigenous perspectives that are inclusive of us, our voices, and Indigenous perspectives locally, nationally, and globally. Oh, I want to mention here, this photo was given to me by my patients, in that my teacher spoke of a time in the future when the white raven would return, and that would be the time of our medicines to come back, the traditional Alaska Native medicines. And I thought that would just be so wonderful to share, in that I know there's a white buffalo calf woman stories, and that there has been a white buffalo calf. So I'm really excited and honored to share that traditional knowledge. So we'll look at PBRNs, talk about ACORN and the underrepresentation of research in the Great Plains. My program is related to the CTR, that is the Dakota, with PI Mark Bassett, and then also the COBRE with PI Don Warren. I do have a request for applications out for funding, but I want to sort of jog through this quickly so we can get into the meats of traditional healing, which is really inspiring to me. You can see a photo here that is my sister's painting. My sister Sonia Kelleher Combs is a very successful abstract artist, and also one of my teachers gifted me an eagle feather that was gifted on my graduation from college, and this has our calendar, a traditional calendar on it. So unfortunately, we have a 17-year lag time in translating science into practice. And so I have a photo here of my tortoise, Nicodemus, and something isn't right on his x-ray. And even though he's fine, he did have a foreign body. And to me, this is just an example of something just isn't right in science and medicine when it takes a decade to 2 to 3 to translate science into actual practice. And that's what practice-based research networks aim to do, is address the obvious need and rapidly translate the science to improve quality, safety, and effectiveness of healthcare. Like me, they kind of emerged in the 1970s, and now we have over 200 in the United States that are organized by the Agency for Healthcare Research Quality, the ARC, and you can see their website there. This is an example of currently existing PBRNs or PBRNs that developed before our ACORN, and oh, good. You can see that our practice-based research network, the American Indian Collaborative Research Network, covers the Dakotas, Wyoming, and Montana, so fills quite a gap as far as providing research opportunities for providers and communities in the Northern Great Plains. We also have underrepresentation for funding, and these IDEA programs, the COBRE and the CTR, are funded in a way that is underserved. So here you can see all the IDEA states, and there you can see the funding where it's been, where the ARC has funded programs. So our goal is to improve the presence of science and funding to have better outcomes in our health for the Northern Great Plains. Ideally, this is a partnership between clinicians and practices. You'll see some of our partners in an upcoming slide for community-based healthcare. And ideally, we're inclusive of underserved and historically underrepresented perspectives, persons, communities. And PBRNs are quite pleomorphic, so they don't have to just be one way or run one way. So what is, I think, a helpful approach for our practice-based research network is to have priorities based on community interaction, and to define our community-based research priorities as time moves by. So the American Indian Collaborative Research Network emphasizes American Indian, rural, and underserved populations and addresses the needs of our partners. It sprouted out of the need for clinical research infrastructure in the Northern Great Plains. And the symbolism is important because acorns require traditional knowledge to prepare. They're used as medicines and food, and entire forests can grow from the complex nature of their single seed. And we must be aware that the FDA and others at the NIH, et cetera, have an emphasis on increasing diversity and inclusion as we move forward. This is a schematic that gives you the overview of my salmon colored acorn at the bottom of the screen. So you'll see that acorn is related to our community engagement and outreach core that is shared through two of our large research institutions here at UND, both Don's Cobri that we're meeting for today, and then also the Dakota, or the CTR on the right. So there's different definitions of translational research, and this is defined generally in science by T0 or bench research to T3, T4 research, where we're translating science to affect health of populations. There are other ways to look at translational research, meaning that we can take science and apply its knowledge to the community. There's a couple different schematics just showing you that typically the clinical research process is that we identify a knowledge gap and often in a top-down manner define the studies that need to occur, and then the studies occur from that T0 to T4, 5 linear process. Whereas a practice-based research on the right, we can identify a gap and implement results, perhaps through engaging communities on which ways they would like to have their interventions for addressing their overall health stressors, minimizing or reducing risk of diabetes, et cetera. Just another schematic to show us that ideally within PBRNs, the communities are identifying the problem. And oftentimes that can even include our providers who have connections to communities, or in this case, tribal institutions and other partnerships. Here's a summary about our pilot grant award, and I'm grateful for Susan Thompson, whose email is listed at the bottom there. Just so you know, we do have pilot grants available on our website, and see the web for more. One example of the success of community-based interventions is the ECHO program. I've been working on a palliative care project and will soon be giving a didactic about primary care approaches to caring for adolescents with psychiatric complaints from the American Indian patient perspective. So I'm trying to respond to community needs when it's requested of me to speak about a topic, such as recently I spoke at the National Indian Health Board regarding COVID and chronic long haul COVID and these such things. I try to address the community need. So just looking at ECHO as a model for starting small and then expanding all across the globe to address education for primary care providers. Just reminding us the NIH has a goal to improve research infrastructure, much as Dave Wilson was just talking about, and engaging local communities. And they also have a Unite initiative that's helpful to know about, where we understand stakeholders, research health disparities and inequities, improve the culture and structure for equity and inclusion, practice transparency, and improve the extramural research ecosystem, which might require changing policy culture and structure to promote workforce diversity. One example of the lack of inclusion is that only 5% of genome-wide studies included minority individuals, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. Of course, there's many other ways that American Indian, Alaska Native, or other minority groups are not represented in science. there's a big push and emphasis within Indigenous communities and also within the scientific community to include and recruit individuals who are participating in clinical trials and willing to facilitate and foster that trust. So there's a great webcast that discusses the importance of this imperative. And our ACORN partners who have signed a collaborative research agreement that summarizes our willingness to work together in a mutually beneficial way include Monument Health based in Rapid City. We're hoping to roll out a multi-center clinical trial, thanks to Jeff Hostetter starting those studies where we look at screening colorectal cancer with a blood test and validating that test. We're also working on that study through the family medicine centers. Our other partners listed as partners 4, they're located in both Bismarck and Minot. The Community Healthcare Association of the Dakotas, CHAD, is another partner, and this is a really valuable partnership because it gives us that opportunity for community-based priorities and having access to over 65 sites within the Dakotas. We're currently working on a Great Plains data network and co-locating primary care and food pantries to improve access to food and help to reduce stigma. And our medical student Holly Bierce is working on her research project this summer to help them address validating co-housing food pantries with primary care. Oyate Health is a tribally owned community-driven healthcare system that represents Pine Ridge, Cheyenne, and also includes Cheyenne River and also Rosebud representatives. I think we just saw an update on Facebook that they're looking and recruiting for a Rosebud representative. So if anybody knows anybody, reach out to Oyate Health. And I'm really honored that our network at ACORN continues to grow. With this list, we have 99 sites currently, which I think is pretty remarkable considering we didn't exist a year ago. We have both internal and external stakeholders and an organizational structure that includes community members who will be engaging as time moves forward. And the important piece here is that really our clinicians and institutions through our RFAs or our research projects and outreach will ideally partner with patients and communities to define their needs and improve their health outcomes. And this just further outlines that each clinicians, investigators, institutions, and communities can benefit from this kind of partnership. Our current projects include partnering with the Association of American Indian Physicians and the American Heart Association, where we're collaborating on a manuscript to explore knowledge and gaps for cardiovascular and cerebrovascular disease throughout the lifespan in American Indian and Alaska Native women. It's a big, tall order, but I'm working on collaborating that and really honored to work on that. Also received EBSCOR funding to develop curriculum for middle school students to facilitate trust and knowledge around designing clinical trials. I'm working in conjunction with Don Warren and Kyle Hill on the Great Plains Initiative funded by the National Institutes of Drug Abuse through the Clinical Trials Network of the Ohio Valley Node. And I see Frankie is on today, so good to see you. So through that sub-award, we're going to facilitate a readiness assessment and obtain a tribal research agenda through working with the Great Plains Behavioral Health, Tribal Health Directors Association, and then further work on a feasibility study for telemedicine to utilize to treat opiate use disorder. And I have some experience from years of experience treating opiate use disorder back in Alaska with medication assisted therapy. I mentioned some of the projects at CHAD. Of particular interest, we're collaborating with some partners in Wyoming to create a Great Plains data health network through a program called Azara, and that will be really exciting because we'll be able to house our data and have all of the CHAD partners, over 65 sites, on that same data network. I'm also serving as the community advisory board member for the Recover trial for post-acute sequelae of COVID, and that's a multi-center 35 center trial looking at acute COVID, COVID in kids, and long haul COVID retroactively, where folks who maybe had infection in the past are also enrolled in the studies. So that just gives you a little idea of some of the things I've been up to within the practice-based research network and getting the research network off the ground and some of what we are. But this is all within the context of what I felt was necessary in order to be a traditional healer. So for as long as we can remember, Indigenous people have been connected to the lands that we occupy and the lands here on the earth. So the earliest hominins have been around for 4 million years at least, whereas modern humans have existed for 200,000 years. So long, long time for humans to be in relationship with our surroundings, to be observing what is medicine, what is health and healing, and what defines us in a state of health. Most Indigenous peoples, from the scientific Western perspective, have been in their current homelands for hundreds to thousands of years. For my tribe, it's 16,500 years that we've been around the Tangle Lakes area. And this is really validating for me, though my people believe that we have been in our current lands for as long as we have existed. So there's a way to understand things through a traditional lens and also through that Western lens. Ultimately, a time of imbalance is what my elders say has entered. And this is mostly through a process that elders refer to as an extractive economy that started out with papal bulls and other processes which legalized acquiring lands and resources that were previously or currently occupied by Indigenous peoples. Traditional practices of medicine have survived in pockets and have been passed down in many different ways throughout the globe. And Alaska Native and American Indian traditional healing practices still continue to survive. I adapted this slide from Don Warren in combination with some of the work that Rupra Maria has done with the Mini Wachoni project. So let's say that a brief history of medicine, and it's coming full circle. In approximately 2000 BC, we would say, here, eat this root, it's healthy for you. Later on, that root is heathen with the influences of maybe more dominant cultures and practices. And as Dawn said, Indigenous practices were even illegal at one point in time. So they would say that root is heathen, say this prayer rather. Then the prayer was thought to be superstition, maybe drink a potion. That potion later was snake oil, swallow this pill, the ill to the pill phenomenon entering into the 1900s. Later on in 1950s, the pill is incomplete. Remember that we suddenly have antibiotics now. And then genetics are to blame and specific therapies were used. Turns out that inflammation is known to be the modern cause of many of our chronic diseases. So it turns out roots influence genes. So eat this root anyways, back to the beginning. And that's how medicine can be. And when it comes to exploring the causes of inflammation, it's extremely complex. And Rupra Maria has done a great job of simplifying it here, talking about some of the difficult effects of colonialism and how it has persisted based on supremacism and different types of supremacy, white supremacy, male supremacy, and human supremacy. Considering the Indigenous perspective, we consider everything on this earth to be our brothers and sisters. And for some people, you know, having rock brothers and sisters, water brothers and sisters, your relatives surrounding you on the earth, is a different concept, but that is just how we were raised, knowing to respect and approach everything as if it has a value, a living value. Nonetheless, this model shows that capitalism is fueled by these different types of supremacism that allowed genocide and slavery to continue, and it's within which this setting actually early medicine in our country was established, and that medicine was created mostly to empower those who were the colonial powers. And these complex influences led to increased trauma, more inflammation, and those disparate disease states that Dr. Warren was talking about earlier. So how about an overview of some of the traditional healing ways of promoting health? We practiced healing hands, or laying on of hands, for lots of different things, not just muscle and bone manipulation, of which I've studied, also other things such as needling or poking to release what is called bad blood. We also performed versions of breech babies and other things like minor brain surgery and bioidentical suturing with hair, you know, before we had reabsorbable sutures. So Indigenous people have actually contributed a lot to science. We developed the original bulb syringe for irrigation, making surgery possible, and lots of other botanicals. In my apprenticeship as a traditional healer, we would start each day with prayer. And each day with prayer, often cleansing the healing space with fumigation, so burning of the plant body, or also using essential oils if we couldn't do that, or sometimes just even blessing water and using water as a blessing. We participate in songs and dances, and also know that certain sounds of our language are sacred and healing in and of themselves vibrationally. And biofield medicine is a big part of what traditional healers do, in that there are many measurable frequencies and energies that traditional healers work with, including different forms of visible and non-visible light, magnetism, infrared, heat, and other things. So we have specific dances and ceremonies, and many of our dances and ceremonies that survived in Alaska are our mourning ceremonies. So what I see is in the future that we'll have more of our celebratory ceremonies, and I've been honored to participate in powwow recently, and I've been honored to learn story there about how, say, for example, jingle dress, jingle dancing came from a medicine person praying for healing. And it's just such a beautiful metaphor, and it gives me so much hope. Of course, traditional plant medicine, which you see there with some bluebells and some fireweed stalks, continue to be practiced and create an opportunity for us to have deep ecological knowledge and interrelatedness with our earth, and knowing that each plant community has its own relationship with itself and its neighbors, and also with us. So it's a tremendous opportunity to share knowledge and also caretake our plants that sometimes are over-harvested. Traditional knowledge is distinct from Western knowledge. You can see that my niece Kyra is learning how to scope moose, and she's looking in the wrong direction, but that's okay. She'll get it eventually. Western knowledge has to be proven by quantified knowledge and requires rigid planning structure and sometimes millions and billions of dollars, whereas traditional knowledge is transgenerational, can be inherited, and has tremendous value akin to wealth. It can be guarded and protected, sometimes shared when appropriate, when the time is right. So for example, I have certain techniques that my teachers have told me are allowed to be taught to Indigenous people. So I have certain permissions with different pieces of knowledge that I carry and different protocols that have to be respected. In general, our knowledge is passed down from elders, but also we can observe. I was taught to do nothing but observe for 3 months when I started my apprenticeship with a traditional healer. We also learned from direct experience, dreaming, vision quests, stories, and just being in deep connection and relationship to the earth and our surroundings. For example, when I was in Sedona learning with teachers, I saw this plant that you see here. It's an Artemisia sage plant, and that is our most powerful medicine in the north. And so learning about how the people brought that plant there up into the Anasazi ruins, to me, it seemed that they had a medicine plant right outside of their door. So traditional knowledge is highly valued, sometimes as if our life could depend upon it. It's won through hard work and deep conversation and silent listening to those important culture bearers. And I acknowledge Elise Cronin, her work that she's done with Northwest Coastal Tribes. You see here a picture of a heart-shaped kinnick. This is known as bearberry or uva ursi, Arctostaphylos uva ursi. So this is our traditional tobacco. And what that meant was that we were taking plant body and burning it to transform it, to bring our prayers, thoughts, and that sense of balance to a higher vibrational state, very different than conventional tobacco smoking, right? So we have a long connection of place-based knowledge, and historically, this knowledge wasn't written down, but now is a time that our knowledge is so threatened and diffuse. It's sometimes we hold bits and pieces of it, but maybe not the whole picture. So I've been encouraged very much by my elders to do the work, to bring this knowledge to light, and to continue to build the body of evidence and to share that so that it doesn't disappear and so that our knowledge will continue into future generations. We struggle as Indigenous people with a history of untrustworthy behavior from the scientific perspective, so unethical interactions with medicine, including things such as sterilization, research, unethical research without consent. And that's hard, but I think we have to acknowledge it and bring it to light. What I was told is that bringing things to light and processing them together, it brings the difficult things into the sacred fire so that they can be burnt by the sacred fire that sits in the center of all of us and becomes the ashes which feed the earth and in turn feed us and others. So sharing story, talking story about difficult things helps us all to heal. So other things that we should keep in mind when addressing traditional medicines and their research is that there is an aspect of things being sacred and needing to be protected, and also sovereignty, and what that means and how it continues to evolve and maybe be individualized to persons or tribes or communities in different ways. So all of these concepts continue to evolve and be defined by intelligent, capable folks such as yourselves. So there is a great study which is outlined here by Oster, working with First Nations people in a mixed methods way, where cultural continuity, or being who we are, was found to be foundational to health in successful First Nations folks. So those who had less diabetes were more likely to speak their language. Language was found to be a protective factor for diabetes prevention and also for suicide prevention. So being self-sufficient as a nation for Alberta's Cree and Blackfoot nations were imperatives, and continued struggles with government policy were seen as creating trauma and contributing to inflammation. The intergenerational effects of colonization continued to impact the culture, which was thought to be that protective factor. And further, those who had more cultural continuity had significantly less diabetes prevalence. So that is evidenced in this diagram, showing you that Indigenous language knowledge was associated with less diabetes. A few other take-home points from this particular study. The importance of being who you are, and that requires knowing who you are, was underlined. A strong attachment to and respect for culture, and that all things flow from our culture were important. Descriptors of culture included sacred, essence, well-being, livelihood, balance, respect, way of life, and everything. So very big concepts. And culture teaches people how to walk in this world, and includes, but is not limited to, traditions, values, knowledge, hunting and trapping, living off the land, traditional food, medicines, games, sweats, spirituality, ceremonies, celebrations, praying, and language. Culture permeates aspects of life as an Indigenous way to live and a harmonious way to live. So this is just reminding me to mention that language was also thought to be protective against suicide and suicidality, in addition to diabetes. I listed some different resources nationally, including the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine, that hopes that we can combine or promote healing practices globally. So there are different terms for other types of traditional healing, and one of them that's used and coined by the AIHM is global healing traditions. So I kind of like that term. There are other groups of researchers mentioned there, and the World Health Organization also does advocacy around traditional healing and traditional healing research. It defines traditional medicine as the sum total knowledge, skills, and practices based on theories, beliefs, and experiences indigenous to cultures, whether explicable or not, are used for health maintenance, prevention, diagnosis, improvement, or treatment of physical and mental illness. Pretty comprehensive definition. And also they've adopted a declaration that calls upon member states and other stakeholders to take steps and integrate traditional medicine, complementary and alternative medicine into national health systems. And I just honor Gashamet's, the swallowtail butterfly, who is from our upper kingdom, or the beauty kingdom, the Sky Clan. And we always in the spring honor that time when this beautiful creature comes back to our land. So it's just about time for Gashamets to fly again. When I was becoming a traditional healer, a title afforded to me by my community, not by myself, my teachers encouraged me to travel abroad, to travel to other places where traditional medicine was practiced, in addition to practicing my own ways. And I was blessed enough to go to Gomuk, and the mouth of the cow at the source of the Ganges River near Gangotri, a very sacred place in India, northern India. And so here you can see a picture of the glaciers as they're melting, and the source of Mother God, Ganga, the Ganges River. So this slide is about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that can be leveraged to help us to establish, retain, maintain our sovereignty, in that Indigenous peoples have the right to their traditional medicines and to maintain their health practices, including the conservation of their vital medicinal plants, animals, and minerals. In India, they've even had some laws that recognize that there is a value to maintaining rivers, and that rivers have the individual right to exist. So there's some interesting global perspectives and policy around Indigenous perspectives there. Ethnomedicines globally, or those global healing traditions, include not only traditional Alaska Native medicine, where we historically use one plant rather than a multitude of plants, as opposed to something like traditional Chinese medicine, where you might use a lot of different plants in a formula. And they also evolved their medicine so that they were utilizing needles to stimulate points to augment or in addition to their plant and herbal medicine. There are also biofield medicines such as Qigong or other types of medicines in Chinese medicine. There's Tibetan and Ayurvedic medicine, Hawaiian, Korean, Thai, Vietnamese, Hmong, Egyptian, African medicine, and lots of others. There's a particular medicine called healing touch, which is utilized in health systems in America and globally, and is largely practiced by registered nurses, but was developed out of traditional indigenous knowledge from Mexico. And so healing touch is a standardized practice of a particular kind of traditional medicine. So I've already talked quite a bit about the different types of medicine. We talked about the hands-on healing. Botanical medicines include an important concept that is missing from Western medicine, and that is the idea of tonifying or toning the body systems, body, mind, soul, body, mind, spirit, and emotions. And so to tonify means that we take medicines that prevent disease. So we don't take the medicine to prevent disease, rather we take it to be our healthiest, most balanced self. I hope that makes sense. But our medicine from interior Alaska is blueberry, and we believe in Sinhala, or that the beauty and balance of medicine comes from the earth, that the source of our life and life energy comes from the earth. So those things that grow close to the earth, such as blueberries, have big medicine. So we would drink 1/3 of a cup of blueberry tea per day, and there's a tremendous amount of data around the health benefits of blueberries, and particularly the preventative benefits for things like neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's, other diseases such as blindness or retinal diseases. Blueberry is also helpful for diabetes, but I do have to caution my patients sometimes not to go overboard with their blueberry tea, because it can bring sugars down precipitously. It's actually quite an anti-diabetic. So there's lots of other types of medicines that we have contributed to science, and also continue to use in our local for our local medicine. Traditional counseling and talking story is a really important method for healing and wellness that I should acknowledge, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do a little bit today, is model some of that talking story. So I hope that'll give us all a chance maybe to share a little bit more. And I have to mention here that purification or fasting, I used to be so foolish. I thought that meant just fasting from the calories, but really what I learned over time is that it's fasting from what elders refer to as the spirit of other plants and animals, so that you can truly be your own body, your own energy body self, rather than being influenced by the energy of other relatives that we put in our body. So I became a tribal doctor, the first tribal doctor that is a physician trained at South Central Foundation. And here's a look at our team of tribal doctors in Anchorage. And we had two modalities, physical and counseling. And what I was able to do was work with these traditional healers to create a way to quantify and describe our practices, particularly with improving pain and also looking at quantifying visits. So in particular, if our customer owners establish care with a traditional healer, they would have decreased specialty visits, whereas high utilizers had 12 visits per year. You could decrease that to 1 to 2 visits a year if they establish care with the traditional healer, thereby decreasing overall costs and burden on the system. We saw decreased ER visits and decreased primary care visits, but what was very different is that they increased behavioral health visits. So we were able to help folks build and foster trust and get into those other settings. In Alaska, we have lots of different models for incorporating traditional healing into the clinical setting, and there are other models nationally. I wanted to acknowledge some of our plant medicines. So I have our sage, which is a type of mugwort in the bottom right, Artemisia telesii or trushki or chaichilk. You can see blueberries in their blossom form in the blue container there. We also have chaga to the top left. That's our medicinal mushroom. And there are other types of integrative medicine, particularly osteopathic manipulation and Hawaiian lomi, traditional Hawaiian healing, that are all based on indigenous practices. So osteopathic manipulation also comes from American Indian practices. I want to acknowledge that the University of Arizona Center for Integrative Medicine and Scripps out of San Diego have been tremendous resources for me over the years. And there are traditional forms of reflexology. And in my tribe, in our village of Nalahado, we actually had a practitioner who was an acupuncturist. So she had metal needles and was needling up into the 50s and 60s. So for traditional healing, we have the opportunity to utilize strengths-based research that's community grounded and link that to global healing traditions. I mentioned that osteopathic manipulation, which is thought to be mainstream from the Western perspective, is actually Cherokee bodywork that A.T. Stills and others standardized and taught. And in my experience, I've been practicing osteopathic manipulation since I was a teenager. I was blessed to have a teacher right out of high school. My elders say this osteopathic manipulation is exactly what our traditional healers used to do. It was very, very similar to even the medicine that was practiced, the body manipulation in remote rural Alaska. So craniosacral and polarity are other modalities that are actually thought to derive from American Indian body work. So how about this idea of, do we have to quantify things? Do we have to qualify things? Do we have to validate them? Well, I'm really grateful to Bev Warren, Dawn's mom, who has become my unchi, my grandma, and she's my teacher. And I remember a few weeks ago her saying, I don't need a literature review to tell me who I am. And I believe that is 100% true and to the point. But also, we do benefit from folks like Nicole Redvers and others and their work who help us to better understand what are the needs, what are the gaps, and what are the knowledges that we have that contribute to the body of information around traditional knowledge. So I'm just going to paraphrase some of what Nicole published in this Traditional Indigenous Medicine in North America, a scoping review, looking at there being over 7 million Indigenous people in US and Canada. And that she utilizes or created this publication to summarize the state of literature for practitioners, scholars, and communities so that we could better understand Indigenous traditional medicine and hope to address our needs to deliver better care and then also influence policymaking. So this scoping review did not include ethnobotanical or plant medicine. And the 5 themes included general traditional medicine, integration of traditional and Western medicine, ceremonial practice, use of traditional medicines, and traditional healer perspectives. And some of the highlights of this include this quote from Lori Alvord, who's our first Navajo surgeon and a friend of mine also on the board of the Association of American Indian Physicians. And in Nicole's paper, it says, traditional medicine is described in the Navajo culture as a medicine that is performed by the Hatali, which is someone who sees a person not simply as a body, but as a whole being with body, mind, and spirit, seen to be connected to other people, families, communities, and even to the planet and universe. And I appreciate this so much because during my last ceremony, at home, I was reintroduced to my ancestors who I was told were the Northern Lights people. So I just love the interconnectedness and the opportunity to see such great scholarship from my colleague, Nicole. So traditional medicine is critically important for Indigenous health. Due to often upstream structural and socio-political factors, it can be challenging to study and address our needs, and we must create open and safe spaces to indigenize treatment options and ensure that these steps towards wellness occur, namely decolonization, mobilization, transformation, and healing to address those upstream causes. I'm reminded also from the website of the Indigenous Research Support Initiative. Without the trust, there would be no research. And I honor my great-grandmother, Agnes Summer, who was our last practicing medicine woman. She had a circle tattoo on her hand signifying her gifts. And I'm still learning stories from her. I thought I would share a couple of other stories and perspectives around the salmon and the importance of my tribe. My clan from my tribe is the King Salmon clan, and the King Salmon are under tremendous hardship and face tremendous adversity because of several factors, pollution, but also increasing temperatures that limit their propagation. So the King Salmon clan, my clan, stands for resiliency, and the King Salmon swim in the middle of the river. So I'm just reminded that we have important work to do connecting back to our brothers and sisters, the salmon, as we return in our practices, inclusive of traditional medicines. On the top right, you see off the coast of Nome, the Bering Sea that used to freeze over every winter, and the hope dog sled races were run across to Russia. But the sea ice freezes no longer, and it's very rare when we have a hard freeze. So there are no more races that occur across that, across the Bering Sea. We have an increasing opportunity to learn to harvest our plants in the summertime. They grow quickly in harsh environments and have some of the highest antioxidant levels in the world because of this. but our plant medicines can't be grown in laboratories. You see my niece Kyra there on the bottom right picking salmon berries or cloudberries, and no one has figured out how to grow these in the laboratory, which is quite a valuable mystery. One of the tenets of our Dana or Koyakan Athabascan practices is our redistribution of potlatch. So it's a big part of our culture to get together and share. We also have ceremonies, and particularly our honorings of those who have passed. Every 2 years we have a stick dance ceremony, and that's an example on the bottom right where we dance around our spruce pole and acknowledge those that have passed and reciprocate with tremendous gifting to all those that have helped us. And our clan system plays into this because we have 3 clans: that which is above, that which is below, and that which is in the middle. I'm reminded of the importance of gut science. So in our imagery and beliefs, we believe that the gut is a doorway to the soul, and that the food that we eat feeds that gut and our spirit. And we even use the adventitia of guts, or the gut linings, in not only our windows traditionally or our parkas for repelling water, but also in art, as you see here from what my mom made. She's an artist as well. So the gut is so important, and traditional and foods influence microbiome, moods, and inflammation. So all traditional foods are known to have high quality fats, lean proteins. They often include bone broths in traditional diets, which are high in minerals and micronutrients, include wild harvested organic berries and greens, and also include fermented foods, of which we have several different types of fermented foods from the north. This is from Alan Gaby's nutritional medicine text, and what Alan does is say that traditionally ancestors had a diet that was very high in healthy fats, and those 75% fats have been replaced by a diet whose calories are provided by up to 70% carbohydrates, furthering the picture of why so much inflammation. So this is just acknowledging some of our imagery, our staff that used to be outside of our 6-sided traditional hall. We acknowledge the upper kingdom, the Caribou Beauty Clan, the middle of the River Clan, the King Salmon, and then also the lower clan, or the Earth or Bear or Strength Clan. And we all take turns helping each other when we need help. And historically, everyone belonged to one of these clans. And the science of belonging is an aspect of the science of things we have yet to explore in the future. So I want to acknowledge that Athabascan traditional homes look very much like inipi or sweat lodges. And the dot within a circle motif is such a beautiful, powerful representation that we have in the north, but it certainly reflects our houses, our homes, the circle of life, and the interconnectedness of us to next generations and passing on of knowledge. This is just a summary of traditional concepts or values, accepting what life brings. And as a traditional healer, that's very different when you take the knowledge that is taught to you and accept it, rather than, I think, this more inquisitive, linear perspective from Western medicine, where you're kind of given start to end knowledge in medical school. In the traditional way, you accept what life brings and have patience, while living carefully and seeing interconnectedness all around us. I was told that in the future, great-grandmother spiderweb internet would connect all Indigenous people across the world. And I really am honored that that time is coming now, where we could all connect in a like-minded way, or to share information. And just be aware that integrative medicine is also an advocate for traditional medicines, where we apply a sliding scale of evidence, and the greater the risk something to cause harm, that the stricter the standard of evidence it should be held to.
In Bhutan, they practice traditional, their traditional medicine practitioners are also trained as providers, and they frequently have traditional medicines and conventional medicine available in the same facilities. This is a picture of birch bark cambium, which we used for anti-cancer, for metastatic breast cancer, for one of my dear friends and family members. And this was a medicine taught to me. My grandmother, Rita Pitka Blumenstein, who is a member of the International 13 Indigenous Grandmothers of the World and just passed away last year. She said that the past is not a burden, it is a scaffold which brought us to this day. We are free to be who we are, to create our own life out of our past and out of the present. We are our ancestors. When we can heal ourselves, we also heal our ancestors, our grandmothers, our grandfathers, and our children. When we heal ourselves, we heal our Mother Earth. I was able to visit Bear Butte to hold ceremony for her on her 40-day feast and was honored to do that. Some of my current teaching and advocacy includes developing a decolonizing medicine talk as a part of themes and didactics for medical school at the University of Alaska Anchorage and the University of Washington through the WEMI program. I'm working on an iHeart and iHeal collaborative to develop health workforce development of American Indians and Alaska Natives, and also to include Indigenous ways of knowing in healthcare settings and in healthcare training settings. I'm continuing with botanicals and hands-on workshops, including one later this month for the Association of American Indian Physicians in Santa Fe, and also facilitate talking circles for communities and students. Our practice-based research network, the ACORN, is holding a summit August 4th in Sioux Falls, and there'll be more information about registration on our website. And I just want to thank you so much and honor my ancestors for bringing us all here today. So with that, I know there's not a whole lot of time, but I'd like to open up to questions.
Looks like there's a question from Kathy McAlpine. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, oh, there's an echo. I have both computers on. Let me just stop this. I wondered, well, one thing, if you could go back and put your contact information up again, just real quickly. I have a student that I mentor through the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, and she just won a national, international grant on food insecurities, ways of solving that through local community involvement. And I'd love for you folks to meet. I sent her an email. I don't know if she's in the midst of doing something right now. She's in an internship right now, but I would love for you to meet. But her name's Joanna, but then I'll write that to you. The other thing is that I have wondered, I'm interested myself. I have a particular practice that I do. It turns out I can smell things like strep and things like that. University of Penn are studying people like this. It's unusual. It's almost like being a person that's in a world of vibrant colors, but most of the people are colorblind, but you see them. And so when I get exposed to stuff, I have a routine that I use because I can tell I'm exposed, and it includes rinsing my nose and some other things. But because I've been hardcore trained in Western medicine, and also all the rules and regulations of things being practiced in a certain way and proven in a certain way, I maybe share it with my family. I can tell other people what I do, but I can't necessarily in a legitimate way share it with my patients. I would love to talk to you about this because it has protected me. I stopped pretending that I didn't notice, and I started doing it, and I have been in situations that it's amazing I haven't gotten sick, but that's more anecdotal. I would love to talk to you about some of this at some point. Could you put your contact stuff up there again? And I'm going to take a picture of it and I will be in touch.
And thank you. I
Yes.
really appreciated this. My cousins grew up in Anvik, actually.
Oh my gosh, that's wonderful. What a small world. Well, Christina Beiswinger has chatted in my email, allison.kelleher@und.edu, and I'll just share the screen briefly with that contact information so you can take a snapshot. And I'm really happy to talk story around, these different gifts that we have. That contribute to, the diversity of contributing to health, our individual health and overall health. So that's really exciting that you have that gift. And I think there's a lot of work for us to do around helping to better understand gifts and gifting and how to support individuals who have healing and health related gifts. So it's great. Thank you so much for sharing. Masi, Anabasi, Wopila.
Are there any more questions? Okay, thanks so much, Dr. Kelleher. A wonderful presentation. Okay, now we'll be taking a brief break for lunch. And when we come back, we'll hear from the first of the COBRE funded project scientists. Dr. Andrew Williams will present on stress and health in American Indian pregnancies.
Sounds great. Thanks, everybody. Have a good lunch.